Chapter 878. Oh, is that so? Yu Lily raised her voice as if she was very interested and asked, "What is it about?" "Ah, you'll know when you get there. I promise you won't be disappointed." Shin Manting chuckled and looked like she was going to win. His tone and attitude made it clear that he was certain that Yu Lily would come. "I see." Yu Lily nodded and looked serious. "Well, wait a minute. I'll be there soon." "Okay." Shin Manting was very satisfied with Yu Lily's understanding and said, "Oh, Ming likes obedient women. No wonder he likes you so much." After that, she hung up the phone. Yu Lily looked at the phone and sneered, "Naive." After saying that, he blacklisted Shin Manting's number. When did Oh Ming like obedient women? Yu Lily tilted her head and thought for a moment. She suddenly felt that Shin Manting was a little sad. She shook her head and then continued to browse Taobao with her mobile phone. Shin Manting sat in Starbucks for half an hour, but she didn't see anyone like Yu Lily. Shin Manting furrowed her delicate eyebrows and felt a little displeased. She picked up the phone again and dialed Yu Lily's number, but it showed that she was not in the service area. What happened? No signal? Shin Manting dialed again, but the result was still the same. At this time, even if Shin Manting was stupid, she realized that Yu Lily had blacklisted her. Shin Manting was furious. She angrily hit the table and gritted her teeth. Many people turned to look at Zhang Xian. Shin Manting's face softened a little. She stood up and quickly walked out of the coffee shop. Yu Lily looked at the time and was in a good mood. She read comics on her mobile phone and quickly browsed the current popular comics rankings. She just read half of it and soon there was another call from Mystery. It was also an unknown number, but the place of origin was Kingstown. Even if she thought with her knees, she knew who the caller was. Although Yu Lily was in a good mood, she didn't want to answer it at all. Yu Lily rejected the call and directly blacklisted it. On the other side, Shin Manting was so angry that she gritted her teeth. This woman dared to play with me like this. Tc. She started the car and drove to Oh Ming's company. Oh Ming was busy in the office after the meeting. Suddenly, someone from the secretary's office came to inform him, "Master Oh, Miss Shin is here." Hearing this, Oh Ming frowned and said, "I'm busy. I won't see you." The secretary was a little embarrassed and continued, "Miss Shin said that she has something very important to tell you. She seems to be a little angry. Why don't you see her?" When Oh Ming heard that, he smiled coldly. He looked up at her and asked, "Who are you working for?" Hearing this, the secretary nodded and retreated, closing the door behind her. When he walked out, he saw Shin Manting sitting in the living room, drinking the best coffee with her legs crossed. She was wearing a beige fur coat, her curly hair was tied up, and her exquisite makeup made her look charming and sexy. She was as beautiful as an Asian lady. However, such a woman had a bad temper. Chapter 879. Hearing Shin Manting's question, the secretary couldn't answer and was a little embarrassed. Suddenly, she turned around and saw a figure. Feeling a great surprise, she shouted, "Special Assistant Su." Su Qing came over here. Naturally, he had already heard what Shin Manting had just said. Seeing Shin Manting's obviously unhappy expression, he said calmly, "Master O has recently been following up an overseas investment case, which is worth up to 50 billion yuan. If Miss Shin has nothing to do, please don't disturb Master O easily." Shin Manting listened with a face full of suspicion. She looked at Su Qing and asked, "Is what you said true? Is it an overseas investment case?" Su Qing nodded and said calmly, "Of course. Why would I lie to you?" Shin Manting snorted coldly and uncrossed her legs. She then picked up her handbag and walked out of the room. Seeing Shin Manting's movement, Su Qing looked at the secretary with a sullen face and said coldly, "Why don't you see Miss Shin off?" The secretary immediately followed and said, "Miss Shin, this way please." Seeing Su Qing's attitude, Shin Manting felt very uncomfortable and immediately changed her face. Turning around, Shin Manting stared at Su Qing and said, "Special Assistant Su, you'd better pray that I don't find out that you are lying to me. Otherwise, I have plenty of ways to deal with you. Don't forget I am your future wife." When Su Qing heard the words, he nodded slightly with a smile and said, "Of course not." Although he said so, there was no respect or fear on his face. "I'm just a worker. How can I deceive the future proprietress? Master O is really busy." If you don't believe it, Miss Shin can go in and have a look and question Master O face to face, lest he says that I don't respect the future wife of the president. I'm so wronged. Shin Manting's voice paused and she was angry. Go in and have a look? Confront Oh Ming face to face? How could it be possible? Who didn't know that Oh Ming had a bad temper and was impatient with everyone? Su Qing actually asked her to confront such a person. Wasn't it obvious that he was ridiculing her and laughing at her? Shen Manting stared at Su Qing for a long time before she stamped her feet and turned to the elevator over there. Su Qing watched Shen Manting walk away, and the expression on his face became more and more indifferent. With a cold face, he looked at the secretary who had just returned and said, "Are you new here?" The beautiful secretary shrank back a little and nodded. "Come in, let's have a meeting." As soon as Su Qing entered, all the people in the secretarial office stood up and shouted, "Hello, Mr. Su." Su Qing nodded and said, "Don't you know what kind of person is coming? Shen Manting, don't send a newcomer next time. In short, it's not urgent. Master O is busy. If he can't handle it, he can come to me." The people in the secretarial office looked at each other, nodded, and said in unison, "Yes." Su Qing walked out and entered the president's office. After knocking twice on the door, Su Qing signaled that he was coming in. O Ming stopped what he was doing and looked at him with his arms crossed. "Just now Miss Shin came. She didn't look like she came with good intentions, so I sent her away. I think she's going to inquire about Miss Yu next." When O Ming heard that, he chuckled and shook his head slowly. "She might have already been found. Pay attention to that woman's movements. If anything goes wrong, report it to me immediately." Chapter 880. O Ming, who had intended to continue working, stopped and looked up at Su Qing. Su Qing's back was stiff, and for a moment he was frozen in place. The atmosphere was awkward. O Ming looked at him for a few seconds and said slowly, "Shen Manting." Su Qing got the answer and immediately understood. He nodded and said, "Got it, Master O. I don't need you to keep an eye on my own woman." O Ming lowered his head to work and said casually. Su Qing felt even more uncomfortable. He straightened his back and nodded. "Okay, Master O, then I'll go first." "Okay." O Ming did not look up. Su Qing immediately turned around and went out as if he had been pardoned. However, even before he went out of the door, he heard O Ming's voice coming from behind. "Oh yes." Su Qing froze on the spot like a wooden stick, not daring to move. O Ming continued, "Help me find a position in Eurasian comics. First, an editorial assistant. Give it to you." Su Qing nodded with his back to O Ming and said, "Okay, Master O." "Go." Su Qing really did not dare to stay. He opened the door and immediately went out. After closing the door of the office, Su Qing came out and quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Facing the eyes from the secretary's office, Su Qing pretended to be calm and stepped out. But before he reached the elevator, his cell phone rang. It was O Ming. Su Qing's heart was immediately alarmed. He picked up the phone and immediately shouted, "Master O." "Okay." O Ming's voice came and said, "Don't make it too obvious. You let you think that she earned the position by herself. This is a small matter. Solve it as soon as possible." After that, O Ming directly hung up the phone. Without the slightest mercy, Su Qing stood in the same place. It was not until the elevator arrived that he reacted and sighed. Walking into the elevator, Su Qing made a phone call to Eurasian Comics. Yu Lily was browsing the web, and suddenly a message popped up on her mobile phone. "Eurasian Comics is recruiting." Recruiting? After Yu Lily clicked on it, she quickly finished reading it. Eurasian Comics is recruiting. They were recruiting editors, and their main job was to solicit contributions from cartoonists. They were equivalent to the agents of celebrities. The salary was very impressive. Yu Lily looked at the salary introduction on it and felt excited. But without a computer, in such a large apartment there should be a room similar to a study, right? She exhaled and walked out of the room. After walking around, he realized that this apartment was really not just big. There were 4 or 5 empty guest rooms. There was also a gym and a small izakaya. It took Yu Lily more than 10 minutes to find the study. In the study, there were all kinds of certificates of honor and all kinds of treasures. There was a limited edition sports car model, antiques that were obviously old, calligraphy and paintings. There were shelves on all 4 walls of the study. On the wall facing the door there was a large display cabinet, and on the left and right were bookshelves. The bookshelves were crammed with 2 walls full of books. Famous works, ancient and modern, Chinese and foreign, as well as rows and rows of handwritten notes. It was the first time that Yu Lily had seen such a spectacular scene. It turned out that O Ming was a person who liked to collect books. I really couldn't see it. Yu Lily picked up a book full of German and flipped through 2 pages. There were rows of notes on it. Chapter 881. O Ming's handwriting was beautiful, vigorous, and powerful. Among these 2 pages full of German, O Ming's Chinese was particularly outstanding. Yu Lily's eyes were full of infatuation and admiration. Although she couldn't understand what was written on it, she still turned a few more pages and looked at Ming's notes. After he finished reading, he put the book back and casually picked up another one. This time she finally understood some of it because it was in Japanese. Lily shook her head and thought of the time when they lived together in Shishan. But Ming was not often in the Shishan villa. Thinking about it, he either went to another woman's place or came back to this apartment. It was good to come back here. The environment here was so good. Although it was only an apartment, the environment and decoration here were much better than the Shishan villa. Especially compared with the current Shishan villa. No wonder Ming said it was more comfortable here. It was more than comfortable. Even the mood was very different. In the middle of the study, in front of the high display table, there was a large white desk. In the middle of the desk there was a computer with a large screen. Next to the computer were thick notebooks and various file racks. Lily glanced at the computer and was not in a hurry to turn it on. Instead she called Ming first. Ming was busy. He glanced at his cell phone and saw the words, "You Lily," and his mood suddenly improved. He picked up the phone and turned on the speaker. Lily's voice quickly came over and said, "Hello." "Yeah. Ming, can I use your computer? I am in your study now." Ming heard that, chuckled and slightly teased, "You actually know how to say hello. Go ahead, there is no password." He seems to be in a good mood. Hearing this smiling voice, even Lily's mood improved. She nodded and said, "Okay. Then I will hang up." "Well, if you are bored at home you can go out for a walk. There is a card in the drawer of the study. It is the same password." "There is a card in the drawer of the study? Is this specially left for me?" Lily was in a better mood and nodded. "Okay, bye." Ming let go of the phone. After Lily hung up the phone, he looked at the documents on the table and his mood became better. The corners of his lips rose unconsciously, and just as he lowered his head, his phone rang again. It was Special Assistant Sue. He picked up the phone and spoke first. "Special Assistant Sue." Su Cheng's whole body quivered. Ming actually spoke first. "Oh my god, so scary. Young Master I have arranged everything. Everything is ready now, and we are just waiting for Miss Yu to submit her resume." "Submit a resume?" Ming's voice rose slightly, and his tone was a little strange. "Submit what resume?" Su Cheng coughed lightly and said awkwardly, Didn't you say to make Miss Yu feel like she earned it herself, She briefly explained the arrangements to Ming. Ming raised his eyebrows slightly, nodded and said, "It sounds good, but does it have to be so complicated?" Su Cheng, forget it. What's done is done. Let's beat them at their own game. Su Cheng. Yes. After Lily hung up the phone, the corners of her mouth rose unconsciously. She turned on the computer and opened the drawer while the computer was on. Chapter 882. It was the one she used before and the card number was exactly the same. Lily picked up the card and looked at it. On the handwriting column of the card, the words, "OU," were clearly written in elegant handwriting. Ming Lily. So it was OU. This was written by herself before and it was still there. Did Ming keep it all the time? The computer rang and it turned on much faster than she thought. After opening the social media tool, Lily sent the website on the phone to the computer, then opened Word and began to edit the resume. Lily majored in computer science at university, but she dropped out before graduating and went to Yunnan. Later, she wandered in Yunnan without success, so she went to the capital. Who would have thought that he would end up back in Kingstown? After thinking about it, Lily simply wrote a self-introduction and a mental monologue. After checking it again and again, she sent it over. Su Cheng was still thinking that Lily would look down on the small salary, so she didn't even want to send her resume now. In case she couldn't complete the task of Ming, then she would definitely be punished. But just as he was worrying about it, his phone suddenly rang. Someone sent a resume. This recruitment announcement was only open for an hour. After Lily clicked on the push, it only lasted for 10 minutes, and then the advertisement window was closed. Because it was an internal unspoken rule, Su Cheng directly left his email address. He received 4 or 5 emails in succession, but none of them were from Lily. Just when Su Cheng almost gave up and planned to find another way, he received an email. This sender name was definitely special to Su Cheng. Lily's resume. After a cursory glance, Su Cheng saw the resume and surprisingly had a good impression of it. The words were appropriate and full of sincerity. But it was too honest and she actually wrote all her education and experience. However, this Lily had far exceeded Su Cheng's expectations. Originally, he thought that a woman like Lily should be just a vase, but the literary talent of her resume was very different from what he had thought. After thinking about the words, Su Qing quickly replied to the document. What he meant was that he thought Yu Lily was very suitable and hoped that she could come for an interview at 10 o'clock the next morning. He also briefly talked about the salary and job description. After confirming that there were no problems, Su Qing sent it out. As soon as he sent it out, he heaved a sigh of relief. What a joke. The lady opposite him was very likely to be the future boss's wife. After being entangled with the big boss for so many years, Ming still couldn't forget her. Compared to her, what was that Miss Shen? The reply from Eurasian Comics was much faster than Yu Lily had imagined. Yu Lily opened the email expectantly and was so happy that she almost jumped up. He actually let her go for an interview. This is great. Full of excitement, Yu Lily stood up from the chair and skipped back into the room. What should I wear for the interview tomorrow? The interviewee was only an editor's assistant. The salary during the probation period was only $3,000. The salary after becoming a regular employee was not announced, but it would definitely not be much higher. In this line, unless one became a regular editor, they could rely on commissions to make a living. Otherwise, they would only have a fixed salary. However, when Yu Lily opened the wardrobe, she found that all the clothes were branded. Chapter 883. With Yu Lily's current identity, would it be too exaggerated to wear famous brands to the interview? However, she didn't bring the clothes she used to wear in the capital. Yu Lily was a little worried. She took out a dress that looked a little more low-key and compared it with her body. It seemed that it was not low-key. Clothes make the man. This sentence was true. A better brand would give off a completely different feeling on the body. But now Yu Lily didn't want people to know the relationship between her and Ming. It happened that this Eurasian Comics was also under the banner of O Group. If it was found that she lived with Ming, I'm afraid there would be a lot of gossip. Yu Lily thought about it and went to Ming's study to pick up the black card. After changing clothes and going out, Yu Lily went to a nearby ATM to withdraw 1,000 yuan. Wearing famous brands and a simple and beautiful bag, she walked to the famous affordable pedestrian street in the city. She spent 200 yuan to buy 2 sets of skirts and cheap trousers. Then she went to a store that looked good and spent more than 300 yuan to buy a coat. While it was beautiful, Yu Lily put away the clothes and sent them to the dry cleaning shop. Then she went to the pedestrian street to buy a bag of more than 100 yuan. In this way, there was only more than 200 yuan left of the 1,000 yuan she withdrew. More than 200 yuan was far from enough to buy a digital tablet. Yu Lily went to the second-hand market and bought a second-hand one, which cost a total of 130 yuan. After shopping, it was already past 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Yu Lily didn't have lunch at noon, so her stomach was growling. She picked up her mobile phone and called Ming. Ming was leaning on the chair to take a nap. When he heard the phone ring, he glanced at it casually and saw it was Yu Lily, so he picked it up. Yu Lily sounded very good and asked, "What do you want to eat?" "I'll go to buy vegetables." Ming didn't have a housekeeper, so he usually didn't go out to eat. That was not good. Yu Lily had been a housekeeper for Ming for a period of time, so cooking was not a problem at all. When Ming heard Yu Lily's words, his lips were slightly raised and he looked very happy. He thought about it and said, "I'll eat whatever you cook." "Well, then you can't be picky later." Yu Lily's voice was with a warning, but she was full of smiles. He was in a good mood. Ming could see that. After stretching, he continued to work. Yu Lily didn't know if there was a vegetable market nearby, but there was a fresh food supermarket downstairs. Ming had always loved her cooking, especially eggplant and braised pork ribs. Yu Lily was a great cook. After buying a few ingredients, Yu Lily returned to the apartment. Yu Lily opened the password key, blinked, and pressed a series of numbers. It was her birthday. The password is wrong. Yu Lily was a little disappointed and pressed Ming's birthday. When the door opened, Yu Lily breathed a sigh of relief. After entering, she used the rice she had just bought to make fish head tofu soup, eggplant with garlic sauce, and braised pork ribs. It was a very simple home-cooked dish, but Yu Lily was very happy to make it. When Ming returned, Yu Lily had just unpacked the food. Hearing the commotion outside, she ran out wearing an apron and shouted, "You're back, it's time to eat." Chapter 884. Ming's eyes were particularly soft that day. He stood tall and straight as he walked towards the dining room. After washing his hands, he sat down. Yu Lily filled his bowl with rice and brought all the dishes out. "There are only 2 of us, so we don't have to cook so much. But I haven't cooked for a long time, so I don't know how it tastes. You can try it." Ming took the chopsticks she handed over, lowered his eyes and ate a mouthful of rice, then picked up a piece of pork ribs. Familiar taste, Oh Ming's heart was suddenly overflowing with warmth. He looked at Yu Lily with the same warmth in his eyes. Yu Lily was a little scared by his gaze. She twisted uncomfortably and said, "You, just eat. Why are you looking at me?" "It's better than before." Oh Ming looked at her and chuckled. "It's delicious." Yu Lily was even happier. She gave him a bowl of soup, put it in front of him and said, "You often work with your eyes. Nourish them. You're in such a good mood?" Oh Ming took it and scooped a spoonful. "Yes." Yu Lily put down the chopsticks and said excitedly, "You know, I found a job. I sent my resume online today, and they asked me to go for an interview tomorrow." "What a coincidence. You just told me a few days ago that you would arrange a job for me, and today I found one." As she spoke, Yu Lily felt something was wrong. She looked up at Oh Ming and asked, "Did you arrange it?" Oh Ming curled his lips and said innocently, "I just came back from the capital and I was so busy. How could I do such a small thing?" "You think too much." "Really?" Yu Lily was a little suspicious. She looked at him and nodded, reluctantly believing him. "Speaking of which, this company seems to have something to do with your company?" "Oh, really?" Oh Ming pretended to be surprised and asked, "What company is it?" "I won't tell you. I'll tell you after my interview." Yu Lily took a sip of soup and felt a little proud. "My cooking has improved again. It's delicious." Oh Ming laughed and nodded. "It's really good. What job are you going to interview for tomorrow?" "I won't tell you. I said I'll tell you later." Yu Lily scooped a bowl of rice for herself and took a bite. Suddenly, she thought of something and warned, "Don't investigate. All right, as long as you want to do something bad, I can let you do it." Yu Lily looked at him with a sly smile and asked, "What do you mean by bad things?" "Recreational clubs and the like. You're not allowed to sell alcohol or other scams or prostitutes. Selling meat." Did he still think that she had sold herself for a living for the past 4 years? There was clearly nothing there. Hearing that, Yu Lily's expression changed slightly and she looked at him. Oh Ming immediately sensed that something was wrong with Yu Lily. He cursed in his heart. After putting down the bowl of soup, he earnestly said, "I'm not suspecting you. I'm just making an analogy." Yu Lily lowered her eyes slightly, and her tone was no longer as light as before. She said in a low voice, "Oh Ming, do you really think that I have been living by selling myself in the past few years?" All of a sudden, Oh Ming was speechless. Chapter 885. On second thought, if Yu Lily was really willing to live on that, then she would not live so miserably, right? With Yu Lily's beauty, it was easy to get along in that kind of place. The premise was that as long as she was willing, Oh Ming knew the value of this woman better than anyone, so he naturally had doubts. Now that he was relieved, seeing Yu Lily's expression, Oh Ming felt even more guilty. Every single humiliating sentence he had uttered a few days ago was enough to make her feel wrong to the point of death. What a great injustice. When Oh Ming was about to speak, Yu Lily's eyes were already red. She looked up at Oh Ming and bit her lower lip. There was a little bit of tears in her eyes, which looked beautiful and dreamy. "If I tell you that I didn't, will you believe me?" Yu Lily looked at him, sniffed, and her throat was slightly choked. With a little bit of crying, she said, "In the past 4 years, I almost couldn't live many times. I was very poor. When I arrived in the capital, I was cheated of all my money. All the money you gave me before was cheated. When I was the poorest, I slept in the pedestrian tunnel, went to be a thief, cheated people, and even wore a beautiful dress to beg on the roadside." Oh Ming's heart was stuffy. Looking at her, Oh Ming's peach blossom eyes were full of pity and heartache. He didn't know any of these things. In his world, Yu Lily was missing for 4 years. Similarly, in the 4 years when Yu Lily was missing, Oh Ming did not appear. He never knew that she had lived so miserably. It was worse than he had imagined. No wonder she couldn't live. "Yu Lily, there was a man behind me. He saw me on the roadside and thought I was very beautiful. He introduced me to work as a waitress in the nightclub," Yu Lily said, but she stopped crying and sneered. Oh Ming was caught off guard by this sneer and his heart tightened. Yu Lily looked at Oh Ming and said seriously, "In the past 4 years, if I had such a thought, I wouldn't have lived so miserably. Do you know why?" Yu Lily's eyes were like the best obsidian, bright and smooth, beautiful and without a trace of impurities. It was as if there was a mirror inside, and Oh Ming's reflection was clearly reflected in it. Subconsciously he asked, "Why?" She smiled brightly and looked at Oh Ming. There was not a trace of impurity in her eyes. Her smile was bright and beautiful. She said, "Because there is a man in my heart. Except for that man, I don't want anyone else." It contained a man. Oh Ming looked at her and his breathing became erratic. His first reaction was to take her as his own. This man, is he himself? After all, he was her only man. But wasn't the man in her heart the one with the surname Liu? Could it be that the one with the surname Liu had slept with her? He looked at her and asked, "Who is that person?" Lily felt a little hurt. She summoned up the courage to confess, but she didn't know who that person was. However, looking at his obviously moved expression, Lily inexplicably felt that he was a little cute. She said, "That person is very bad. When I was still underage, he began to raise me. After he used gentle attacks to make me fall, he turned into a big bad wolf and ate me. I thought I hated that person because he was overbearing and exclusive just like the landlord in the past, but, dash." Chapter 886. But, Lily was halfway through her sentence when she suddenly stopped. Hearing Lily's words, Ming felt a little itchy and couldn't help asking, "But what?" "But I found that after living together for a long time, there are feelings. I thought I hated you, but in fact, when I was in the most difficult and desperate time, the first person I thought of was you. After I left Kingstown, I stayed in Yunnan for 3 months. In Lijiang in Yunnan, there is an activity which is to close your eyes and write the name of the person most important to you. I wrote your name." She always thought that the person she liked and wanted was Louis Han. But until she left and walked alone on the country road in Yunnan, she found the most real feelings in her heart. In the first month when she left Ming, she missed him, and missed him. She missed him crazily and wanted to go back. But at that time Lily did not dare to go back. She knew that she could not go back. Not only the death of the 2 children, but also the death of Li Xiqing was enough to make Ming hate her. Lily was not afraid of death, but she was afraid that when she went back she would face Ming's hatred and hysteria. She could not bear that feeling. That feeling was worse than death. It was not until later that Lily realized that she only liked Louis Han when she was young, that she couldn't get him. She also envied Su Chenxi and longed for Louis Han's love. Or rather, it was more of an obsession. An obsession that could not be achieved but was not willing to let go. Knowing the answer in the deepest part of her heart, Lily's obsession with Louis Han had slowly dissipated, no longer the same as before. Lily looked at him with a smile and clearly saw Ming's dark brown eyes, which were full of emotion and disbelief. Looking at such a beautiful smile in front of him, he suddenly felt his heart beat fast. Ming's heart jumped uncontrollably. His heart was beating wildly and he was overjoyed. Ming had never felt so happy before, and in an instant he was surrounded by it. "What is Lily saying? Is she just confessing to me?" Ming had never heard of such a confession. From the beginning to the end, there was no word about love, nor was there any word about liking. Yet, it was able to make him feel the feeling of liking and the existence of love invisibly. At this moment, Ming had completely forgotten to react. There was only one thought in his mind: she cares about me and I like her. Ming did not know whether he was happy or unhappy. He looked like he was in a daze. If it were 4 years ago, Ming would be so excited that he would hold her and run around. Now, after all, 4 years had passed and everything had changed. Chapter 887. In fact, what Lily wanted to hear most was the word, Ming's girlfriend. When it came to Lily, she no longer felt dirty in her heart. Instead, it was a simple, mutual love relationship. Just like an ordinary boyfriend and girlfriend, they were naturally close and together. When Lily spoke, her head was getting lower and lower. Lily. Ming's voice suddenly sounded from behind, which startled Lily. She suddenly straightened up, looked up, and turned her head. Ming was on top of her head, looking at her with a pair of eyes. That pair of eyes was like a dense forest in the moonlight. The wind blew and the waves were endless, undulating, but it was so beautiful that it made people intoxicated. Lily looked at him and then, Ming suddenly lowered his head and kissed her lips. Without any defense, Lily looked at him with her eyes open, and her eyes gently blinked. From Lily's angle, she could clearly see the deep smile in Ming's eyes. It was like a little firefly flying through the forest, dreamy and beautiful. With a smile, Ming gently lifted her head and deepened the kiss. Lily closed her eyes and obediently responded. Ming's heart was full of waves. It was like a small boat in the vast sea, pushed left and right and finally returned to its own shore. Excited and moved. Ming's arms from her front, holding the back of her head, gently as if carefully protecting the most beautiful treasure. This kiss had nothing to do with lust. But it was the most comfortable moment for Ming in the past 4 years. After a long time, Ming gently released her. They gasped for breath and looked at each other. Lily's neck was a little sore, so she lowered her head and gently twisted her neck. Ming's eyes were deeper and his lips were slightly raised. He whispered, "What you said just now, were they all serious?" Hearing that, Lily looked up at him and her lips were also gently raised. She stood up, put her hands through his arms around his waist, looked up at him and said, "Can I?" No. Ming put his hands on her upper body, and his lips were slightly raised. When Lily heard those words, she was a little unhappy. She lowered her head and was about to say something, but Ming kissed her lips. Ming's movements were a little wild, and he didn't give her any space to escape. He pressed her down and kissed her. Lily passively endured it. She leaned her head back and breathed heavily. He looked a little excited and said, "I don't need a nanny. I need you." Lily was still panting, looking at him with astonishment in her eyes. "From now on, you will live here and fulfill your responsibilities as a girlfriend." Ming looked at her with a wicked smile, and his eyes seemed to melt Lily. Lily's heart was beating faster. She looked at him and stammered, "What is the duty of a girlfriend?" "Eat together, sleep together, wake up together, play together, laugh together." Ming's eyes became darker and darker. He looked at her like a mysterious black hole that wanted to suck her in. Ming continued, "When the time is right, we will have children together, live together, and grow old together." His words were better than thousands of confessions. Chapter 888. Ming saw her tears, smiled, and his eyes were full of pity. He lowered his head and kissed her tears gently, saying, "I'm serious, Lily. For years ago I also had such a plan. I even prepared a wedding dress, a wedding, a ring, and a venue just for one day when you told me that you were pregnant. I would propose to you and let you marry me, be my wife, and be the mistress of my family." However, when she successfully became pregnant, the answer she gave him was different. Lily didn't know that in the past 4 years, he had loved her as much as he hated her during this time. When Ming said this, there was no other emotion in his eyes. His eyes were as deep as the sea, and his tenderness was boundless. Lily subconsciously thought of the design drawings she had accidentally seen in his study a long time ago, as well as the site plan. Could it be that those were prepared for her? From 4 years ago, Ming had already prepared everything for her? Is this for real? Lily couldn't believe it. She looked at him and asked, "What about your fiancé?" Ming's face darkened. He looked at her with some displeasure and whispered, "Did she look for you?" There was no denial, so it was true. That Shen Manting was really his fiancé. When she left, she knew about Miss Shen's existence. In the past 4 years, Shen Manting has been by his side, right? Lily felt a little uncomfortable. But she also knew that she was not qualified to express any of her unhappiness to Ming. Now she was still just a mistress. Lily looked down and nodded. "Yes, she called me today, but I blocked her." Ming was in a good mood when he heard that. He smiled and said, "Well done." Lily felt a little inexplicable. She looked at him and said, "Why don't you ask what happened? What if your fiancé was bullied by me?" Ming chuckled, reached out and rubbed her short hair and said, "There is no suspense. She will definitely be bullied by you when she meets you." "You don't like her? What do you think?" Ming's voice rose slightly at the end, which was indescribably evil. Lily's heart was beating fast. She gently pushed him away as if she couldn't accept it and said, "Since you don't like her, why are you still engaged to her?" "My mother arranged it." Ming pulled her aside and continued, "I'm already 31 years old. If I don't get married soon, not only my mother but even my father will come and urge me to get married. I'm the only son in my family." It was the expected answer, but Lily still felt a little disappointed when she heard it with her own ears. Since it was arranged by his parents, it must mean that Shen Manting was a good choice for the family. It was necessary for them to be of equal status, right? This fiancé was personally chosen by Ming's mother, but she didn't even know what Ming's mother looked like. He rubbed her short hair with his big hand and said, "I won't marry her." "Then why did you get engaged to her? Didn't engagement mean they were going to get married?" Chapter 889. Lily felt that Ming's behavior was too bad. She frowned and said, "Then why don't you break off the engagement? It's not good to drag her down like this." When Ming heard this, he chuckled and said, "She was the one who wanted to marry me. The reason why she chose me was because I am Ming. In other words, if Ming wasn't Ming but another man, Shen Manting wouldn't even look at him." Ming glanced at her and said, "This kind of woman, without Shen Luoan's support, can't even win my mother's favor by herself." "Shen Luoan?" Lily was shocked and said, "Shen Luoan? Shen Luo, and one of the 3 young masters of the capital?" This name could be said to be like thunder piercing the ears. In the capital, who didn't know Shen Luo? Just like in Kingstown, everyone knew O Ming and Li Xiqing. Yu Lili had been in the capital for more than 3 years. Shen Luo. This name was too familiar. It's him. Shen Manting is Shen Luo, Anne's sister. Yu Lili's eyes widened and she couldn't believe it. If Yu Lili didn't take Shen Manting seriously just now she really began to recognize Shen Manting's strength. So that's how it is. No wonder O Ming's mother chose Shen Manting. This is the real match, isn't it? And I'm just an orphan with no identity, no background, and no power. Deep in Yu Lili's heart, an emotion called inferiority began to spread disobediently. Yu Lili nodded and clearly knew the gap between herself and Shen Manting. Yu Lili felt a little sad. She lowered her head and said with a smile, "Let's eat. The food is cold." Yu Lili couldn't hide her thoughts in front of O Ming. O Ming could see the emotions in her heart with just a glance. But he didn't expose her. Hearing Yu Lili's words, he nodded and went to his original seat to sit down. After dinner, O Ming had business to deal with, so he quickly went to the study. Yu Lili washed the dishes and cleaned up the surroundings. After confirming that there was no problem, Yu Lili returned to the room. After saying goodbye to O Ming, Yu Lili went out to pick up the clothes that had been sent for dry cleaning. On the way back, Yu Lili saw a vendor selling DVDs on the side of the road. In big letters it said, $10 for 3 tickets. Take your pick. Obviously they were all pirated discs. This kind of small stall owner also had a lot of resources. Yu Lili covered her face with a scarf and quickly stepped forward. She deliberately whispered in Mandarin with a Hong Kong accent, "Boss, do you have spicy dishes?" The boss was also a straightforward person. When he heard this, he raised his eyebrows sensibly and whispered, "That kind is a little more expensive, 15 yuan for 2 tickets. Do you want Japanese, Korean, or European or American? Tell me, I have all of them here." Yu Lili's face was getting hotter and hotter, but she didn't forget to disguise her accent and said, "The spicy touch is expensive, so I'll make it cheaper." "Boss, they're all very expensive. How about this, you buy 2 of the most popular ones and I will give you an African one." Yu Lili almost knelt down. There is actually someone from Africa? Chapter 890. When she went back, O Ming was still busy. Yu Lili blushed and stuffed the DVD into the gap of the sofa. After hanging up the clothes she took back, she went to the room to take a shower. When she was taking a shower, she secretly fantasized about watching that kind of film with O Ming. Would she feel something? Wait, what if O Ming felt something but I can't feel it myself? What should I do? I suspect that you have a cold sex. O Ming's words in the morning were still ringing in her ears. Yu Lili felt a little embarrassed. In the past, when I secretly watched this kind of film without O Ming's knowledge, I could feel it. Now, it should not be too bad, right? However, O Ming was still working. If I secretly watched it now, I should not be discovered, right? After taking a shower, Yu Lili sneaked out of the living room in her pajamas. She took out the DVD from the gap of the sofa. Just as she turned on the DVD, she suddenly thought that if O Ming suddenly came out, wouldn't it be very embarrassing? Oh my god, that would be too embarrassing. Yu Lili couldn't imagine what O Ming's expression would be if he found out that she was secretly watching this kind of film. But Yu Lili was eager to verify whether she had a cold sex or not. Just in case, Yu Lili decided to sneak into the study and harass O Ming. When she walked into the study, she found that O Ming was not in the study. Quietly sneaking into the room, she heard the sound of water coming from the bathroom in the room. With a sigh of relief, Yu Lili quietly sneaked back into the study. After locking the door of the study, she turned on the computer again. After unpacking the DVD, she put it into the CD of the computer. Soon the picture came out. Yu Lili inexplicably felt a little nervous. Looking at the somewhat deceptive plot, her lips twitched. After clicking the mouse to fast forward, Yu Lili looked at the screen. Finally, skipping all kinds of plot foreshadowing, Yu Lili directly moved to the part of the exciting scene. She patiently watched the man and woman on the screen kissing, hugging, and making all kinds of ecstasy sounds. Yu Lili watched helplessly as all the foreplay was completed. Finally, it was time for the real show. She watched as the man entered the room, and the woman screamed out in pain and happiness. Yu Lili's eyes widened. Knock, knock. The door of the study was suddenly knocked and Yu Lili was shocked. He quickly shouted, "I'm inside." There seemed to be a moment of silence outside. O Ming asked, "Why did you lock the door?" Yu Lili found it difficult to speak. She struggled for a moment before saying, "I'm practicing." There was no movement outside, and Yu Lili finally breathed a sigh of relief. His gaze returned to the screen. There was a huge battle going on inside. The process was very long. He was not a second man. Appraisal completed. However, Lily really didn't feel anything at all. Suddenly, the door of the study was opened. As soon as Ming came in, he heard the sound coming from the computer speaker. Lily felt as if she had been caught doing something bad. She was shocked and hurriedly turned off the computer screen. But the battle in the speakers was still going on. Chapter 891. The headquarters of Eurasian Comics was still a little far from where she lived. The drive took a total of 40 minutes, and with the walking time, it was nearly an hour. It was 9:50 when she arrived at Eurasian Comics. Several people had arrived at the scene for the interview. Presumably, there were not many people to be recruited this time, so there were very few people. After interviewing a few people, Lily's name was called. Lily was wearing the clothes that she bought yesterday. It was very ordinary, but the style was not bad. The company's executives inside had a good impression of this girl. Lily introduced herself, and the executives also looked at her resume. They simply asked a few questions such as what work she had done, why she left, and her impression of the company, or why she chose this company. Lily answered them one by one and seemed to be at ease. Then they asked Lily to wait for the notice as usual. As expected, Lily felt that she did a good job, so she was in a good mood. She walked out of Eurasian Comics and looked at the time. It was already past 11 o'clock. She called Ming and he answered the phone very quickly. Lily didn't even realize that the phone had been connected, and she heard the sound of driving over there. After coming to herself, Lily asked, "Hey, Ming, where are you? I'm going to pick you up." "Where are you?" "I'm now at XX intersection." "Well, stand still and I'll be there in 5 minutes. After that, Ming hung up the phone. Lily felt a little strange. He actually arrived in 5 minutes? Did Ming know where I was and then he came here to pick me up? Lily felt a little sweet in her heart, and her lips unconsciously raised. Standing on the side of the road, Lily picked up her lipstick to touch up her makeup. Not long after she put the lipstick away, she heard the sound of a car coming. It was a stretch Lincoln. Ming's car window was down, and Lily clearly saw Ming wearing sunglasses sitting in the car. So handsome. Lily's smile became wider and wider. She opened the door and quickly walked in. "Are you hungry? What do you want to eat?" Ming took off his sunglasses and asked. "I want to eat noodles." "Let's go eat noodles." Lily smiled like a flower. Seeing her smile, Ming was also in a good mood. He put on his sunglasses, started the car, and drove in the direction of a noodle house that Lily used to like. Lily used to be a regular customer, and Ming often came here as well. The manager inside knew Lily. When he saw her, he immediately greeted her and shouted, "Miss you, Master O, long time no see. Please come in." Lily and Ming walked into a private room. After ordering, Lily went to the bathroom. There was no bathroom in the private room, but there were several in the noodle house. Lily was a regular here, so she was familiar with the location of the restroom. Now was the peak period and there were many people coming and going in the restroom. If he went to the nearest restroom, he would definitely have to line up. Lily walked to the end of the corridor where there were fewer people in the bathroom. Chapter 892. The woman surnamed Yu is here again. I thought she was not in Kingstown. The voice belonged to the manager who had just received Lily. Lily stopped in her tracks. She was in no hurry to open the door. That's right. But Ming didn't come here with this woman a while ago. This man is different when he's rich. He has both a fiancée and a mistress. He's so happy. The voice sounded like she was touching up her makeup. I'm so happy. Isn't that so? But Ming seems to have been with that woman surnamed Yu for a long time. Why is that fiancé still willing to be with him? I heard that the fiancé is also famous in the capital. Needless to say, a man like Ming is rich and handsome. Although he is a bit fickle, he also has the capital to be fickle. If I can keep up with such a man, I would rather marry him. Do you want to go to the toilet? No, you go. I'm leaving. Lily heard one of them go next door and the other go out. There was an impulse in his heart to go forward and give all of them a tight slap in the face. However, she couldn't move her feet. Didn't he say that he didn't like the fiancé? Didn't he say that he wouldn't marry Shin Manting? Then why did he come to eat noodles with her? And it was a place she liked to come to. She never knew that the service staff here thought of her in this way. Lily, Ming called her surname Yu, which was just a title. But when outsiders called her that, Lily could clearly feel the contempt and disdain in their words. Her heart felt like it was pressed by a stone and she was depressed. Her throat was choked and her eyes were hot. She opened her mouth and the air came in. Lily looked up at the ceiling. What a loser. After a while the sound of pumping water came from next door. Hearing the sound of high heels going away, Lily stood in the toilet for a long time before she went out. When she washed her hands and walked back to the box, the noodles were already served. Ming turned his head and easily found that Lily's mood seemed to be not quite right. She seemed to be a little depressed than before. What's wrong? Ming asked softly and reached out to pull her. Lily shook her head and smiled. She picked up the chopsticks and said, "Let's eat. I'm starving." Ming looked at her, trying to read something from her face. However, Lily was sitting on the side eating her noodles with her head down. She didn't look any different from usual. After eating, Ming drove to Kongqing First Chinese Medicine Hospital. After Ming explained the symptoms to the doctor, the old doctor suggested that Lily undergo acupuncture. After he was done with the acupuncture, he took a few pills and walked out with Lily. Ming knew the reason for her coldness, but he didn't tell the doctor. Lily didn't realize why, but she was still a little absent-minded on the way home. His mind was filled with the words of the two waiters. Hugging one in each hand, "I'm so happy. We're here." Ming's voice brought her back to reality. Lily looked up, smiled and opened the car door. But before she opened the door, Ming held her hand. Ming looked at her and said, "What's wrong with you? You don't seem to be in a good mood this afternoon." Chapter 893. At least, it was much worse than when he had just picked her up. Lily's back was stiff. She turned her head to look at Ming and smiled gently. Ming's eyes darkened. He reached out to pinch her face and said, "Don't look like that. Smiling is uglier than crying." Lily pouted and touched her cheek that had just been pinched. She lowered her head and asked, "Did I?" "Yes." Ming looked at her with a serious face and said, "What's wrong? Tell me." If I find out that you are lying, I will punish you." Ming pinched her nose intimately and tenderly. Lily's heart skipped a beat. Pursing her lips, she smiled and said, "I just heard something not so good." Ming raised his eyebrows and motioned for her to continue. "I heard that you once took Shin Manting to that noodle house," Lily said. When Ming heard that, his face darkened and he asked, "Who said that?" "The waiter said that they knew me, you and Shin Manting. I heard it clearly in the toilet. They looked down on me and said that I was your mistress. They thought you were very happy because you had a fiancé and a mistress, and you could hug them on both sides." Lily didn't forget to observe his face as she spoke. When she saw that Ming's expression was getting uglier and uglier, she couldn't help but ask, "Is it true?" Ming's face was not very good and he explained, "Shin Manting also likes to come to this noodle house. Last time my mother specially asked her to come to me and let us have a meal together. Shin Manting took me there and told everyone that I was her fiancé." When Lily heard that, she immediately understood. She lowered her head and said, "Why didn't you tell me earlier? If I had known that she had been here, I wouldn't have come. It's so annoying. I feel like I'm being stabbed in the back." "I forgot." Ming looked at her and seemed to be a little helpless. "I only remember that you like to eat at this noodle house. How could I remember what that woman did to me? Besides, it's been almost a year. It's been a long time. Besides, I don't think it's a big deal, so I didn't tell you." "Oh." Lily was a little unhappy again. She pouted and looked at Ming. "Then what kind of matter is considered a big deal? Do you know that when I was in the bathroom just now, I almost cried when I heard about it? I thought. What do you think?" Ming pinched her face. "You're a bad person. If I hadn't seen through you and kept asking you, were you going to keep this secret and live with me?" Lily shrank her head and felt a little guilty. As soon as Ming saw her cowardly look, he knew he was right. Ming pinched her face in disappointment. He sighed and said, "Shin Manting is a European-style young mistress chosen by my mother. This woman is not as beautiful as you, nor is she as sensible as you. It's just that her family background is good. It's a pity that she's already spoiled. I think she'll come looking for you. Yeah, he's already called me once. I can tell that he's very arrogant, but he also sounds like a retard." Chapter 894. Trust. It was a simple word, but when it came to doing it, it wasn't so simple. There was too much between the two of them. Did Lily really believe Ming completely? Not really. But now she had no other choice, right? Lily heard Ming's words and nodded. She looked at him with a pair of bright eyes and didn't speak. Ming looked at her hair with a little heartache. He reached out and touched her hair. Keep your hair long. You look more beautiful with long hair. Okay. Yu Lily's mood was already a lot better. She leaned over and kissed Oh Ming on the face. You go back to the company. I'll go home to paint. Oh Ming's eyes seemed to be floating, misty and deep. Just when Yu Lily was about to withdraw, his big hands held her, and he lowered his head to kiss her lips. He gently sucked and his tongue gently pried open her teeth. Yu Lily hugged him with both hands and the smile on her face widened. She was in a good mood again. Oh Ming's heart was like a mirror. He smiled, held her face and gently bit her lips. He whispered, in the future, no matter what you hear, you have to tell me the truth. Many things are not as you think. I want to be with you and I am serious. I don't want to marry Shin Manting and I am not lying. Soon I will break off the engagement with her and marry you. Oh Ming was a person who valued his promises, and he didn't make promises easily. But once he made a promise he would keep it. Yu Lily nodded and her heart warmed. Holding him with both hands, Yu Lily raised her head and kissed his chin again. She said, I will wait for you. I also have to work hard to make money so that I can be worthy of you. She didn't want to be called a mistress anymore. Never again. Oh Ming's smile froze and he nodded. He rubbed her short hair and whispered, to be my woman, you don't need to be rich. As long as I like you, that's enough. It just so happens that I like you. I like every part of you. There is no ideal type in the world. It's just that one day someone suddenly breaks into your world and catches your eye, so he becomes your favorite ideal type. This kind of coincidence is not as simple as a coincidence. Yu Lily burst out laughing. I didn't expect you to have such awareness. Then she pushed him away and opened the car door. I'm leaving. I'll be waiting for you to come back after I've prepared dinner. Okay. Oh Ming smiled and nodded. Yu Lily got out of the car and looked back every few steps. Soon she walked into the lobby of the community. After Oh Ming watched her walk in, he started the car and headed back to the company. Unbeknownst to him, a beautiful pink car had been parked outside the neighborhood for a long time. A beautiful woman was sitting inside. She had already seen the intimate interaction between Yu Lily and Oh Ming. The coffee cup in her hand was slightly squeezed. Her slender and fair palm gently rubbed against it. She exerted force without making a sound, causing the coffee cup to be slightly deformed. After the Lincoln limousine drove away, Shin Manting got out of her car. He took a step forward and walked to the door. Shin Manting was stopped by the security guard at the entrance. Miss, you don't live here, right? Chapter 895. When the security guard heard that, he frowned and said, What's the name of the person you mentioned? Oh Ming. Oh Ming's name was like thunder to the ears. The security guard naturally recognized him, but he had never seen Shin Manting. The security guard hesitated, took out the pager, called his colleague and said, Oldly, check whether the owner of the 28th floor is back. There is a Miss Shin visiting. Yu Lily just got out of the elevator, entered the password and opened the door, and the doorbell inside kept ringing. It came from the lobby. Yu Lily pressed the answer button, and soon the face of the security guard appeared. Hello, this is the lobby and there is a Miss Shin visiting. Shin? Yu Lily laughed in her heart. Speak of the devil and he will come. Could it be that this Shin fellow was still monitoring her? However, Yu Lily still pretended not to know her, slightly raised her voice and said, Shin? I don't know a friend with the surname Shin. Are you looking for the wrong person? Hearing that, the security guard looked at Shin Manting with a very strange look, and said, This Miss Shin said that she is Mr. O's fiancée. Are you kidding? If everyone says that she is Oh Ming's fiancée, won't he be busy? Yu Lily's voice was a little impatient and she yawned, and her attitude was a little sloppy. Don't ask me this kind of thing in the future. Just drive her away. That's all. I'm hanging up. As she spoke, Yu Lily hung up the phone. After hanging up, she was secretly happy. Yu Lily almost jumped up and happily walked into the room. She put the second-hand digital tablet that she bought yesterday on Oh Ming's computer. Opening Photoshop, Yu Lily began to practice drawing with her hands. Being an original IP was far better than being a painter. If it sold well, she might also have the copyright of TV series, games and so on. In that case, wouldn't she gain both fame and fortune? Yu Lily was painting and daydreaming at the same time, and she was in a very good mood. However, Shin Manting's mood was a little bad. After being asked by the security guard with a serious face, her face immediately changed. After returning to the car, Shin Manting dialed Oh Ming's number. However, it was not Oh Ming who answered the phone. It was Oh Ming's assistant, Su Cheng. Su Cheng held the phone and said respectfully, Good afternoon, Miss Shin. Shin Manting heard Su Cheng's words and was a little annoyed. She shouted, "Where is O Ming?" Master O is busy. He is currently discussing the contents of the contract with foreign partners. The overseas investment case is white hot. If Miss Shen has nothing important, please don't disturb Master O easily. Su Cheng's attitude was neither cold nor indifferent, but the content expressed was very clear. When Shen Manting heard Su Cheng's words, she was so angry that smoke came out of her body. She shouted, "Is this how you talk to your future wife?" Su Cheng secretly sneered in his heart, but his tone was still the same as before. He said, "Miss Shen, Master O is really busy? How about I send you a short video?" Shen Manting felt even more annoyed and sneered, "Fine, let's do it." After that, Su Cheng hung up the phone. Then he used O Ming's mobile phone to make a video call to her. Chapter 896. He was really busy. Shen Manting was not angry. She snorted coldly and was extremely unhappy. In such a busy situation he actually went to have dinner with that woman. How important is that? Does O Ming like that woman so much? Does he like her so much that he even ignores me, his fiancée? Such an obvious gap made it difficult for Shen Manting, who was born with a golden spoon in her mouth and grew up in the palm of her hand, to accept it. Shen Manting secretly calculated in her heart and called O Ming's mother. It was now afternoon, and O Ming's mother picked up the phone for a long time. It sounded like she was taking a nap. As soon as Shen Manting picked up the phone, she said sweetly, "Hello, Auntie." "It's Manting. What's wrong?" O Ming's mother had a cold recently, so when she spoke, her voice was a little nasal. Shen Manting could tell that there was something fishy going on. She exclaimed and asked, "Auntie, are you sick?" When Mother O heard this, she smiled and said, "You're such a careful child. I only said one sentence and you already understood it." As long as it's a person they can find out. Have you taken your medication? Have you seen a doctor?" Shen Manting's caring questions warmed O Ming's mother's heart. O Ming's mother was quite emotional and said, "It's a small problem. It doesn't matter." "That won't do. I'll go to your house to see you. We recently got a new batch of ginseng which is good for your health. I'll bring you one." "Manting, thank you, but forget it. Good ginseng is hard to come by." Hearing O Ming's mother's words, Shen Manting looked at the time. It was 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She smiled and said, "As long as it's for Auntie, it's worth it. Please wait for me. I'll probably be home in the evening." She said home, not your home. Shen Manting's tone showed that she regarded the O family as her own home. O Ming's mother clearly heard it and asked, "Where are you now?" At the same time she also looked at the time. It was afternoon. "Come over and have afternoon tea with us." "Are you busy?" "I'm not busy. I'm just in Zhou City. It'll take about 3 to 4 hours to reach Kingstown. Please wait for me." Mother O was moved when she heard that. She said, "Forget it. You'd better get busy first. We'll get together when you're done. It will take 3 or 4 hours to get here." "No, O Ming is so busy now and he can't take good care of you as his son. As his daughter-in-law, I have to make up for this gap. Please wait, I'll make arrangements first." With that, Shen Manting hung up the phone. When Mother O heard the busy tone from the other side of the phone, her heart was indescribably moved, and she was even more satisfied with this future daughter-in-law. She then called O Ming, but it wasn't O Ming who picked up the phone. It was his assistant, Su Cheng. "Madam." Su Cheng shouted and said, "Master O is in a meeting." "If that's the case, then give me a call after O Ming's meeting. I have something important to tell him." Su Cheng had an ominous premonition in his heart, but he still respectfully agreed. O Ming's meeting lasted more than 2 hours. When it was over, it was already evening. Chapter 897. After the foreign guests left, Su Cheng told O Ming about the phone call from O Ming's mother. After hesitating for a moment, Su Cheng said, "In the afternoon Miss Shen called me. You were in a meeting at that time, so I asked her not to disturb you easily. I think Miss Shen went to talk to Madam about something." Su Cheng didn't know much about Miss Shen. But just from the first few contacts, Shen Manting was very likely to do such a thing. For example, if she found out Yu Lily's existence, she would complain to O Ming's mother. "Well, I see. Go back to your work." O Ming took the phone and immediately returned a call to O Ming's mother. O Ming's mother seemed to be busy. After a long time she picked up the phone. "Hello, O Ming." "Yes, Mom. Manting came to Kingstown today. Go and pick her up." O Ming heard O Ming's mother's words and was silent for a moment. He said patiently, "Mom, I'm very busy. I don't have time to do such boring things. Besides, isn't she in Kingstown? She came to my company yesterday." Why is she not here today? I heard that she's in Zhou City. It's a little far from Kingstown, Mother O said meaningfully. Although you're busy with work, Manting is your fiancé. You can't be too inconsiderate of her feelings. She heard that I'm sick, so she specially came from Zhou City to see me. Remember to be kind and polite. By the way, I heard that you've arranged a villa for her. That's the right thing to do. Treat her well. Manting is a good girl. I see. O Ming was a little impatient. I will send someone over. You don't have to worry so much. I'm busy. But O Ming's mother was a little angry. After hanging up the phone, she sighed helplessly. She opened WeChat and sent a message to Shin Manting. I asked my son to pick you up. Shin Manting saw the message and was ecstatic. She replied, really? That's great. O Ming's mother saw the message, smiled and replied, really? Shin Manting, thank you, Auntie. Looking at the message on the mobile phone, Shin Manting was a little proud. She had taken care of O Ming's mother. It was said that this mistress was an orphan. Let's see how she would deal with her. It took you Lily 2 hours to finish a character. The man in the manga had a straight nose, a pair of beautiful peach blossom eyes, and a beautiful mole under his left eye. His hairstyle was the most trendy design that accentuated his facial features. He was dressed in a burgundy suit, tall and slender. He squinted his eyes and looked forward. He held onto his loosened tie with one hand and squinted forward. His other hand was tucked into his trouser pocket. He was tall and slender. So handsome. Yu Lily's drawing style was different from that of ordinary comics. The characters' appearances and costumes were more delicate. She didn't deliberately outline their facial features. But after all, she was based on O Ming, so you could more or less see his shadow. With a satisfied smile, Yu Lily saved the character. The design of the male lead had been completed. All that was left was the design of the female lead. Yu Lily used the mobile phone to look at herself and smiled gently. Then he started to draw on the digital tablet. Most of the female protagonists in comics were long-haired beauties. Chapter 898. After finishing the character design draft, Yu Lily thought about it, took a screenshot and sent it to Sisai. Sisai quickly replied. Sisai, did you draw this? Yuli, yes, I just drew it. Sisai, awesome. Didn't you say that you haven't learned it? It doesn't look like you haven't learned it. Yuli, I read a lot of comics yesterday. Sisai, this talent is amazing. I have to admire it. The male protagonist is so handsome, but he looks a little familiar. Yuli, I didn't plagiarize it. It's definitely an original design. Sisai, don't tell me you're using something else as a model for your drawing again? Yuli, yes, they're all my friends. I have asked them for advice. No way. However, O Ming wouldn't make trouble for her, and she wouldn't make trouble for herself either. Sisai, okay, but do you want to create your own original work or do you need our script? If it is your own original work, there is no guarantee of a basic salary. It depends on the number of readers. Yuli, how do you calculate the salary? Sisai, look at the PV. If the PV is high, your salary will not be low. You want to create an original work, right? Do you have an outline? Yuli, no. Sisai, you'd better write an outline of the script for me first. 1 episode a week. Can you do that? Yuli, I think so. Sisai, come on, give me a pen name. Yuli, Li Xiaoyu. After discussing the terms of the contract with Zixixi, Yu Lily signed the contract. After getting the contract, Yu Lily found that it was already dark. Yu Lily was shocked and looked at the time. It was already 6:30 in the evening. Oh my God. Yu Lily knocked on her head and quickly stood up. Just as she opened the door of the study, she saw O Ming coming back. Seeing O Ming, Yu Lily smiled and said, I was too absorbed in my painting just now and didn't pay attention to the time. I forgot to cook. Hearing that, O Ming reached out to her and said, it's okay. Let's go out to eat. What do you want to eat? Then, as if remembering something, he asked, have you brewed the medicine? Yu Lily had forgotten all about it. Feeling guilty, she shook her head and said, no, how muddle-headed. You can forget everything, but how can you forget the medicine? As he spoke, he walked out and went to the living room. At a glance, he saw the medicine that he had just brought back on the coffee table. O Ming washed the pot and quickly put the medicine in. Yu Lily was a little shocked and asked, you actually know how to brew medicine? O Ming glanced at Yu Lily. With a hint of smugness, he said, apart from giving birth, there seems to be nothing else I can't learn. Can you cook? You can learn. It meant that he wouldn't. Do you know how to clean? You can learn. That means you don't know anything. Yu Lily looked at Ming with some contempt and said, "Humph, you only know how to brag." Ming smiled and reached out to touch her head. Chapter 899. Ming walked toward her, and Yu Lily ran away with a red face and said, "I'm hungry." "I'm hungry too." Ming looked serious, but his eyes were full of emotions that made Yu Lily feel ashamed and angry. Yu Lily blushed even more. Ming's hunger was not the same as hers. As Yu Lily walked, Ming found that the clothes she was wearing were different from usual. "When did you buy these clothes?" Ming frowned and looked at her with some dissatisfaction. The clothes she wore in the capital should not have been brought here. Yu Lily stuck out her tongue and said, "I don't want to be judged. You see, I'm a girl. If I wear famous brands, won't they think I'm not simple? At that time, someone will definitely investigate me. If she was found to be living with Ming, then things would not be so simple to solve." She had had enough of people pointing fingers at her. When others looked at her, there would always be a label in their eyes, a kept woman. Yu Lily didn't like that feeling. She really didn't like it. Before Yu Lily could finish her sentence, Ming could clearly feel her displeasure. Seeing her obviously accusing expression, his face softened a little. He touched her head and said, "Well, it's up to you. But when you're at home, don't wear these clothes. I don't like them." It was just like Yu Lily when she saw the capital. She was so down and out that it was heartbreaking. Ming also didn't like that feeling very much. Yu Lily smiled, and her smile was like a flower. Seeing that smile, Ming was also infected. With a chuckle, he took her hand and walked out. After the meal, the two returned home together. Ming didn't try again this time. After showering with Yu Lily, he went to work. Yu Lily went out on her own to print the contract. After sending the contract home, Yu Lily took a shower and then lay in bed to think about her new comic plot. She picked up a notebook and wrote it by hand. The next day was Wednesday. Yu Lily's first day at work, so she dressed properly. When she arrived at the place, she found that during the interview yesterday, 2 people had been hired. Yu Lily was one of them. The other one was a short girl. She wore black-rimmed glasses and wore ordinary clothes. She even looked a little rustic. Her name was Shanyu. After informing her colleagues in the department, Yu Lily became an assistant to an editor named Ziyu. As for Shanyu, she followed Sisai. Zixixi's real name was Yi Qianqian. She was a very beautiful girl with long curly hair, a long coat and a long skirt. One look and anyone could tell that she was a beauty. Yu Lily had already sent the contract out last night. She didn't want Sissy to know that she was Yu Xiaoyu. Sitting in her seat, Yu Lily found that this position was extremely idle. The main job was to review the artist's contract and the content of the comic. For the whole morning, Yu Lily was in a state of half busy, half idle, and half bored. But in the afternoon, the company became even quieter, because they heard that a big shot was coming for an inspection. All of them sat upright and still, afraid that they would make that so-called big shot unhappy if they didn't behave appropriately. Chapter 900. She was very beautiful, with fashionable long curly hair hanging on her shoulders, and delicate makeup on her face. She wore a long pink coat with a white dress, looking cute and pure. She was expressionless and a little arrogant. It was the first time that Yu Lily had seen this woman. At a glance, she could see that this woman was a little cold and a little arrogant. The woman seemed to look over, and when she saw Yu Lily, her eyes seemed to be surprised. Yu Lily didn't know who this woman was. Meeting her eyes, Yu Lily was calm, smiled at her and nodded. The woman outside was talking to the person next to her through the glass door, but her eyes were looking at Yu Lily. When the editor-in-chief next to her was talking to the woman, her eyes were also looking at Yu Lily. Yu Lily felt a little inexplicable and touched her face. But soon she turned her head and continued to work. However, what Yu Lily didn't know was that because of this look, her career had changed greatly. When she went to work the next day, Yu Lily was transferred to the company's front desk by the editor-in-chief. Yu Lily felt a little inexplicable. She was clearly working as an assistant editor. How did she suddenly become a front desk lady? Although she was puzzled, as a new employee, the most important thing she could do was to be obedient. On Thursday and Friday, Yu Lily honestly worked at the front desk and reviewed contracts as an editor. The third day was Saturday. Yu Lily had been working for several days in a row. The work intensity was not high, but she suddenly started to work, so she was still a little tired. She didn't get up until 10 o'clock. When she got up, Ming had already disappeared. After washing up, Yu Lily went out and found that Ming was making breakfast. Fresh and good-looking sandwiches were placed on the table, and hot milk was steaming in the cup. When O Ming saw her coming out, he put down the black coffee in his hand and waved to her. "Come here and have breakfast." Yu Lily was full of happiness. After washing her hands, she picked up the 3 words. "Super delicious. How do you know how to make this?" "I told you there's nothing I can't learn other than giving birth." O Ming was beaming with joy, and there was an indescribable smile in his peach blossom eyes. He also picked up a sandwich and took a bite. "Drink a mouthful of milk. The medicine is almost ready. After breakfast you can take the medicine in half an hour." This traditional Chinese medicine was used to adjust Yu Lily's cold sex. Yu Lily ate the sandwich and nodded. Halfway through breakfast, O Ming's cell phone rang. Yu Lily glanced at it and vaguely saw a name on the screen, Shin Manting. Yu Lily paused, but she quickly looked away and pretended not to see anything. O Ming didn't feel that anything was wrong. He calmly picked up the phone and ate his breakfast. However, to O Ming's surprise, the person on the other side was not Shin Manting, but his mother. "Lil, oh, where are you? Today is the weekend. Come home. I haven't seen you in a long time. I miss you." When O Ming heard this, he paused in the act of eating and looked at the time before saying, "All right, then wait for me. I'll go home in a bit." "Go home." When Yu Lily heard these 2 words, she looked up at him. What he said was, "Go home." Didn't O Ming dislike Shin Manting and that fiancé? But why would he have a family with her? That. Chapter 901. What he said was to go home. Didn't O Ming dislike Shin Manting and his fiancé? But why would he have a family with her? And the word "go home" came out of his mouth. It was so natural, which was not like a reaction to someone he hated. Yu Lily felt a little uncomfortable and watched him make the phone call. O Ming met Yu Lily's eyes and looked very calm. After hanging up the phone, O Ming ate the sandwich quickly and said, "Today is the weekend, I will go home." Then he stood up and was ready to go back to the room. Yu Lily watched him stand up, holding the sandwich in her hand slightly tightened, and shouted, "O Ming." "Yes." O Ming turned his head and looked at her. Yu Lily looked at his calm expression and felt a little strange in her heart. She asked, "Who was the person who just called?" "My mother, she asked me to go home." When Yu Lily heard this, her heart seemed to be hit by something, and she felt a little uncomfortable. Did he think that I didn't see it? The phone call just now was clearly from Shin Manting. Seeing that she was obviously unhappy, O Ming smiled and walked to her side. He kissed her on the cheek and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back in a moment. I won't be gone for long." Yu Lily looked at him for a long time and then nodded. O Ming quickly went into the room to change clothes, took the car key and went out by himself. Yu Lily watched him go out, and her heart seemed to be blocked by a big stone. After finishing the rest of the breakfast, Yu Lily cleaned up, washed the dishes, took the medicine and went into the study to draw. At the beginning she couldn't get into the mood and her mind was full of nonsense. After about 2 hours Yu Lily felt something. She picked up the pen and began to draw. The day passed quickly, and Yu Lily didn't have lunch at noon. After all, she was a novice and she didn't know how to outline many scenes, so she had to find some landscape pictures to copy while drawing. After a whole day Yu Lily only drew 1 grid, and the efficiency was very low. Yu Lily's neck hurt after bowing her head all day. Twisting her neck, Yu Lily stood up and stretched. She ate some bread to fill her stomach and went to the supermarket to buy groceries. When Yu Lily put the rice cooker down, she gave O Ming a call. O Ming quickly picked up, but it sounded a little noisy on the other end. It sounded like an elderly woman talking. Yu Lily heard it clearly and asked, "O Ming, when are you coming back?" As he asked this question, the surroundings grew quieter and quieter. Obviously, O Ming was avoiding the crowd to make the call. Soon, a pleasant and magnetic voice could be heard saying, "Later. Have you had lunch?" "When do you mean later?" Yu Lily avoided his question and said, "Remember to come back early." "All right, have you taken the medicine?" "Remember to take your medicine, remember to eat, remember to drink more water." The series of reminders warmed Yu Lily's heart. "Well, you too. Remember to drink water and drive carefully." "Okay, I'm a little busy here. I'll hang up first." "All right." Yu Lily threw her phone on the sofa and was in a good mood. Chapter 902. Yu Lily's culinary skills were excellent, especially the braised pork. O Ming loved it every time. But it was a little troublesome, so Yu Lily didn't want to do it most of the time. That day she saw that the streaky pork tasted good, so she bought some. It took Yu Lily more than 40 minutes to prepare that dish. She busied herself in the kitchen. When all the dishes were ready, it was almost 7 p.m. Yu Lily looked at the time and called O Ming. But this time the phone rang for a long time but no one answered. Finally, after a dozen rings, the phone automatically hung up. Yu Lily called again, but this time, it rang a few times before it was picked up. It was very quiet on the other end of the line. Only Ming's voice could be heard. Hello? Yu Lily heard Ming's voice and was a little unhappy. She asked coquettishly, why aren't you back yet? It was a little too quiet on the other end of the line. Even when he spoke, there was an echo. He said, later. I'm eating with my mother now. It's not easy for me to come back, so I have to stay a little longer before I leave. Hearing that, Yu Lily's mind subconsciously thought of the phone call in the morning. His return home. His mother. Why do they make me feel a little uncomfortable? Yu Lily wanted to ask, but she was afraid that he would think she was being too nosy. She hesitated for a moment and said, all right. You go ahead. Well, remember to eat. Ming was a little apologetic. After reminding her, he hung up. Yu Lily looked at the table full of food, and her mood suddenly fell to the bottom. She scooped a bowl of rice for herself and slowly ate it. Just as Ming hung up, Shin Manting opened the door and walked in. She was a little surprised to see him and said, so, you're here. What are you doing in the utility room? Nothing. Ming put his phone in his pocket and didn't even want to look at her. He turned and walked out. Shin Manting pulled him from behind and said, Ming, I'm your future wife. Can't you treat me better? Ming stopped and turned to look at her with a faint smile. He said, Shin Manting, you really dare to say that? If it weren't for my mother, do you think I would be engaged to you? When Shin Manting heard that, she smiled and said, you can't say that. You know your mother's condition. Without my brother's help, do you think your mother would have survived until now? Ming raised his eyebrows slightly and shook her hand off. He looked at her with contempt in his eyes and said, Shin Manting, you're so good looking. Why do you like a man like me? With your looks, you can find any man you want. Why do you have a crush on me? I just like you. Don't think that I don't know that every time you go to the nightclub, you're just putting on a show for me. Do you think that I won't investigate? Shin Manting walked over and raised her head proudly to look at Ming. Just like how I investigated your mistress, I know everything. Chapter 903. Shin Manting was unhappy. She stamped her feet and snorted. Then she followed him out. Ming sat down at the dining table. Shin Manting saw him sitting in front of Qiao Ziqing. She glanced at them and walked in that direction. She walked to Ming's mother and said, Auntie, let me help you with the rice. You should eat more. Qiao Ziqing looked at her daughter-in-law. The more she looked at her, the more she liked her. She nodded and said, okay. Shin Manting smiled proudly and looked at Ming. Ming acted as if he didn't see anything. He took the rice handed by the nanny and lowered his head to eat. Qiao Ziqing was a little dissatisfied and shouted, oh, don't just eat by yourself. Help Manting to eat. Ming picked up some vegetables with his chopsticks and put them in Shin Manting's bowl. Then he continued to eat. His actions were fast and obviously perfunctory. But when Shin Manting saw his actions, she smiled proudly. Her smile was not big and it was extremely difficult to notice. Qiao Ziqing looked at her son reproachfully and said, look at you. How can you treat a girl like this? Fortunately, Manting is magnanimous. After dinner, I will send Manting back. Ming was a little impatient, but when he saw the seriousness and expectation on his mother's face, he couldn't bear to refuse. He said, got it. Shin Manting smiled and lowered her head to eat. Sure enough, if she wanted to control Ming, the best way was to control his mother first. Ming's wife could only be Shin Manting. She didn't believe that with such a good condition, she couldn't be compared with a third son who had nothing. Hearing Ming's response, Qiao Ziqing was finally satisfied and let him go. She picked up some food for Shin Manting and asked, are you used to living at O's place? Yes, it's very comfortable and Ming treats me very well, Shin Manting said with a smile. I'm here to talk about the wedding date. We're not young anymore. I'm already 27 years old. My grandmother told my fortune. She said that I have to get married this year. Otherwise, I'll be in big trouble. Shin Manting nodded. Ming sneered and said with some disdain, what era is this? Do you still believe in this? For this kind of thing, I'd rather believe it to be true than not. Shin Manting looked at Ming with a serious look on her face. The fortune teller also said that our lives complement each other. Let's get married this year, Shin Manting said with a threatening look on her face. Ming nodded. Ming's eyes were deep as he ate. The reason why Shin Manting could say such a thing was that she believed that he had to rely on Shin Luo, Anne's medicine to keep his mother alive. But what Shen Manting didn't know was that Ming had already started researching the cause of his mother's illness 2 years ago. He had also been working on Shen Luo An's secret prescription. Once he succeeded, he would no longer need to maintain this nominal fiancé relationship with Shen Manting. At that time he could openly break off the engagement and marry the person he truly loved. However, before that he could not afford to gamble. Hearing Shen Manting's suggestion, Ming looked up and said expressionlessly, "It's already November and the year is almost over. There's only a little more than a month left. Isn't it too late to say it now?" Chapter 904. In fact, Shen Manting had already told Qiao Ziqing about this. Sure. Hearing this, Qiao Ziqing smiled and nodded. There are still 3 to 4 months until the new year. It's still not too late to start preparing for the wedding. Will I be able to hold a grandchild next year? Shen Manting lowered her head and looked at Ming shyly. Qiao Ziqing smiled even more happily and teased, "This girl is actually shy. What's there to be shy about? It's settled then. I'll ask someone to check the date tomorrow." "What's the hurry?" Ming put down the bowl. "I've just been planning an overseas investment project. I'm very busy recently. I'm afraid I don't have that much time to do this." "It doesn't matter." Shen Manting smiled brightly. "I know you're busy. Just leave it to me. It just so happens that my brother has nothing to do. I've already asked him to come over and help." "Your brother?" "Yes, you've also met him, Shinjilia." Shinjilia was Shen Luo An's younger brother. He was also a doctor, but he majored in psychology. Ming responded and put down his chopsticks. Looking at his mother and Shen Manting's happy faces in front of him, he couldn't express his annoyance. "I don't plan to get married so early, Manting. My career is still on the rise. As you can see, wait for me for a while." "Ming, I can't wait anymore. Do you want me to die next year? I've waited for you for 4 years and you still want me to wait? You're so selfish." Shen Manting pouted and looked like she was about to cry. Seeing this, Qiao Ziqing was also a little angry at Ming's attitude. She said, "The best time of a girl has been wasted by you. How can you be like this? You're going to make me die of anger. Look at yourself. You're already 31 years old. Li Xiqing's twins are running around everywhere. The last time I came over you called me grandma. How can you say that your career is on the rise? You're so useless." "Mom?" Ming felt a little headache. Qiao Ziqing directly interrupted Ming's words. "Anyway, don't worry about it. Go and do your own things. Leave the wedding to me and Manting. We must get married within this year." Shen Manting held Qiao Ziqing's arm and said emotionally, "Auntie?" Qiao Ziqing patted Shen Manting's arm and said, "Manting, don't worry. I'm indebted to the Shen family. I won't let you down no matter what." Shen Manting was delighted to hear this. She sniffed and nodded in satisfaction. Ming didn't say anything. He stood up, picked up the pack of cigarettes and walked out. At that moment, Ming's father, Huijin, walked in. He looked travel-worn. Qiao Ziqing was pleasantly surprised to see Huijin. "You're back? Doesn't it mean that he'll come back tomorrow?" Huijin was handsome. Although he was already in his 50s, he still looked like a man in his 30s or 40s. Huijin's expression softened when he heard Qiao Ziqing's words. He walked over and said, "I heard that Manting is here, so I ended it early. What are you talking about? Why are you so happy?" "Let's talk about our marriage," Shen Manting said with a bright smile. When Huijin heard that, he looked at Ming in surprise and said, "Son, you've finally come to your senses. You know that you can't drag on at your age?" Chapter 905. Are you full? You only ate a little? Qiao Ziqing said from behind, but Ming didn't pay any more attention to her. He walked straight outside. It wasn't just Shen Manting. Even Mr. and Mrs. O could see Ming's displeasure. Shen Manting felt a little awkward. She looked at Qiao Ziqing and asked, "Auntie, is it good for us to force him like this?" Qiao Ziqing looked disapproving and said, "It's not right for you to think that way. Back then, when Lao married me, he was also very unwilling. Later on, he still doted on me like a treasure. Let me tell you, men have to be forced. If you don't force him, he won't be able to do anything." Shen Manting suddenly felt relieved. She nodded and smiled brightly. "That's what my grandmother told me. No matter how playful a man is, he'll learn after marriage. What's more, Ming is such a responsible man." Hearing Shen Manting praise her son, Qiao Ziqing was equally happy. Soon, the two of them began to discuss the matter of marriage. Ming was a little annoyed as he walked outside. After lighting a cigarette, he dialed the number to the pharmaceutical research institute that he had privately built. He asked about the progress and they said a lot, but in the end there was still no result. Ming was already in a bad mood, but it suddenly became even worse. He regretted it. If he had known this would happen, he wouldn't have brought Lily back from the capital at this critical juncture. Now that the matter had not been resolved, and Lily was so sensitive, if she sensed that something was wrong, she would definitely overthink it. What should I do? Ming took a deep drag on his cigarette. He felt a splitting headache. He took his car keys and walked toward his car. Before he could put the keys in, he heard Huajin call out, "Xiao O." When Ming heard that, he turned his head. Huajin stood at the door and looked at him meaningfully. A pair of slightly wrinkled peach blossom eyes looked in his direction and said, "Let's talk." Ming didn't go home, so Lily was in a very bad mood. After dinner, Lily was no longer in the mood to paint. She lay on the bed, her mind full of random thoughts. Holding her phone, she wanted to call Ming, but she didn't dare do it. What if he found her annoying? What should she do? With her current status, what right did she have to ask him where he went and who he was with? Lily was very clear, but at the same time she felt a strong sense of loss. The gap between them was still too big. Lily was extremely upset. After rolling on the bed for a while, she went to take a shower and then went to the study, turning on the computer to draw. When it was about 11 o'clock, Ming still hadn't come back. Lily's heart felt empty. She picked up the phone and dialed Ming. The call was quickly answered and Ming's voice came through. "You're not asleep yet?" His gentle question made Lily feel relieved. She pouted and said, "I can't sleep if you don't come back. Where are you?" Ming was silent for a moment. After a long time he said, "I'm not going back tonight." Chapter 906. "Oh," Lily asked, "at your mother's place?" "Yes." "Remember to sleep early and remember to take your medicine," Ming replied calmly. Lily's chest tightened and she felt indescribably depressed. However, she couldn't say anything. After a moment of silence she said, "Got it. Go to work. Good night." "Good night." After hanging up the phone, the air was dead silent. Her mood seemed to be hollowed out by his words and it was terrible. Lily looked at the ceiling for a long time, then threw the phone away, covered the top of her head with the quilt and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep all night. There was still a lot of food left from last night's dinner. Lily didn't have extra money, so she put it away. She heated it in the microwave and ate some. Her eyes were a little painful, but she couldn't fall asleep. Lily put on a loose sportswear and went out for a run. The apartment where Ming lived was located in the prosperous area of the city, and it was also a very famous area for the rich. There were many parks and squares. Lily trotted all the way and after 2 laps, it was already dawn. When she returned to the apartment, it was already after 9 o'clock. She pressed the elevator button and she was a little out of breath. Suddenly there was the sound of a suitcase being pulled, but Lily didn't care. However, there was a sudden exclamation behind her, and it seemed to be a little surprise. It was a man's voice shouting, "It's you?" Lily didn't know whether it was an illusion or something, but she felt a little familiar. Turning her head, she saw a young man who looked about 25 or 26 years old standing not far behind her. He was wearing a pink suit, pulling a suitcase and looked very well equipped. He had a fashionable hairstyle and a carefully groomed face. At first glance, she knew he was a very particular person. However, the man's smile was bright, and he was full of sunshine and cheerful appearance. At this moment he was looking at Lily with surprise, pointing at her and said slowly, "It's really you. Damn, I was cheated by you last time. You little liar." Lily looked at the man and the familiar feeling came. Seems I saw him when I was a bartender? Could it be that he had been deceived by her? Lily immediately turned her face away and pretended to be calm as she said, "You must have mistaken me for someone else. I don't know you. How is that possible? We must have met before. You are that, who was that? What's your name? Li Xiaoyu? Right, it must be you." Shenjulia looked at her with certainty and said, "I'm very sure, but Li Xiaoyu is definitely your pseudonym. What's your real name?" Lily was a little annoyed. She turned her head and scolded, "Are you crazy? I don't know you. Tieske, I still have that 1982 Lafite." Shenjulia's interest was piqued and he said, "I don't have any intention of getting even with you. I just want to be friends and get to know you better. My name is Shenjulia and I'm 26 years old. I just moved here today. Do you live here?" Lily didn't want to leave him behind. When the elevator arrived, she immediately walked in. Shinjulia followed her in and pressed the elevator button. It was the 20th floor. Chapter 907. Lily was a little impatient. She looked at him with annoyance and said, "Why are you so talkative?" Shinjulia immediately shut up. Lily glared at him and pressed the elevator button for the 26th floor. Shinjulia didn't say another word. He secretly memorized the floor number. When the elevator stopped on the 20th floor, Shinjulia pulled his suitcase and walked out. His smile was as bright as the sun. He looked like a handsome, sunny young man who had just walked out of a comic. "I'll move first. I'll come to play with you later." Lily didn't want to pay attention to him at all. After pressing the button to close the elevator door, she pressed the button for the 26th floor to cancel. Then she pressed the button for the 28th floor and went up. As soon as she went up, Lily felt very sleepy. She changed her clothes, hugged the quilt and fell asleep. He slept until the middle of the night. When she woke up, Ming was already sleeping beside her. He was only wearing a bathrobe. His breathing was even and his arm was on her waist. It was a familiar and natural action, but at this moment, Lily felt a lump in her throat, and she almost couldn't hold back her tears. Leaning into his arms, Lily greedily and carefully breathed, smelling his scent and closed her eyes. The next day, Monday, Lily was directly sent to the front desk and became a temporary receptionist. However, she stayed there for 3 days. On the 4th day, Lily finally couldn't help it. She went to the chief editor's office and knocked on the door. "Come in." After Lily went in, the chief editor just glanced at her, then lowered her head and said, "What's the matter?" "Chief Editor Zhou, when I came here, I was interviewed for the position of an editorial assistant, not a receptionist. Why did you ask me to go to the front desk?" Chief Editor Zhou pushed her glasses and said matter-of-factly, "You are a newcomer, so you should help each other. The front desk is temporarily short of staff, so I just asked you to fill in for a few days. A new receptionist will come tomorrow, and you can go back to the office to work tomorrow." This explanation was a bit far-fetched. Shanyu was still a newcomer. Why did Lily work at the front desk instead of Shanyu? Lily was not very convinced, but when she heard this, she had nothing to say. The next day, when Lily went to work again, she went straight to the office to wait for her shift instead of going to the front desk. Ziyu saw her and said, "Aren't you supposed to be working at the front desk? Why are you still here?" "The chief editor said that I can come back to work here. There will be a new receptionist coming today." Ziyu nodded. "If that's the case, go through this stack." "All right." Lily started working diligently. After about an hour, the chief editor walked into the office. She was a little angry and shouted, "Where is Lily? Where is Lily?" She looked up and raised her hand. "I'm here." "Don't you know that there's no one at the front desk? The delivery man is throwing a tantrum over there. Go and collect the package." Lily felt puzzled and said, "Chief Editor Zhou, what does the delivery man's anger have to do with me? I'm not the receptionist, am I?" When Editor-in-Chief Zhou heard this, she was a little angry and said, "Didn't I tell you to be the receptionist first? You are so disobedient. How can I use you?" Chapter 908. Lily heard the implication and was a little annoyed. Was there anything wrong with what she said? Or was the editor-in-chief just not happy with me and wanted to fire me? But even if she was angry, Lily's job was not easy. Lily could still bear such a degree of targeting. She explained patiently, "Editor-in-chief, I heard you say yesterday that I could go back to the office to work today, so I came back directly. If you had told me that I couldn't come back and had to work at the front desk, I wouldn't have come back to the office." Editor-in-Chief Zhou was a little angry and sneered, "Do you mean to blame me? Is it my fault?" "No, I just said that. Aren't you blaming me?" "Well, I didn't make it clear. This time it's my fault. Go to the front desk." After that, Editor-in-Chief Zhou turned and left. Lily was a little embarrassed and many colleagues looked over. Especially Shan Yu. When she looked over, there was sympathy in her eyes. Lily endured the grievance in her heart and returned to the front desk. After collecting all the packages, she sat at the front desk and reviewed the contracts. She didn't know how long she had been alone. After a while, Yi Chanshan handed a cup of coffee to Lily and said, "Take a break and have a cup of coffee." Lily looked at Yi Chanshan gratefully and thanked her sincerely. "Thank you." Yi Chanshan smiled. After looking around, she went to the front desk and sat with Lily. She whispered, "There was a front desk here and you should have seen it once. It was the first day you came to work." She was still working, but suddenly the editor-in-chief asked her to go home. The next day she asked you to be the front desk and assistant. Did you have a grudge with Editor-in-Chief Zhou before? Yu Lily had expected that Editor-in-Chief Zhou was deliberately targeting her, but she still felt a little wronged when she heard it from her colleagues. After thinking about it carefully, Yu Lily felt that there should be no reason for her to offend the Editor-in-Chief. Shaking her head, Yu Lily looked at Yi Qianqian and asked, "How long have you been working here?" "Meh. It's been more than 3 months." Yi Qianqian took a sip of coffee and smiled. She said, "Eurasian Comics is a new website. It's only been open for less than 3 months, but from the looks of it, it has a promising future ahead of it. But if you work at the front desk, you won't have much of a future. You have to strive to become an assistant editor as soon as possible so that you can slowly learn things." How could Yu Lily not understand this? But at the moment, Editor-in-Chief Zhou was their boss. Above Editor-in-Chief Zhou there was a chief editor. However, the chief editor did not come here often. It was said that he would only come here once or twice. If Yu Lily hadn't guessed wrong, the person who had spoken to Editor-in-Chief Zhou last time and made Editor-in-Chief Zhou act like a lackey should be the Editor-in-Chief of Eurasian Comics. Thinking of that woman, Yu Lily immediately remembered the last time she and Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at her and talked. Is it because of that woman that Editor-in-Chief Zhou is targeting me? But when did she offend her? Yu Lily frowned and thought for a long time, but she couldn't figure out the reason. Speak of the devil. Yu Lily inadvertently looked up and saw the woman at a glance. It was the woman who had a pleasant conversation with Editor-in-Chief Zhou a few days ago. She was suspected to be the chief editor. Chapter 909. Shen Manting walked over with a beautiful handbag. She was twirling a furry ball in her hand. It was a beautiful furry ball of bright red color. Yu Lily recognized it at a glance. This fur ball seemed to be the latest decoration of a luxury brand. It was made from the most beautiful part of the tail of the red fox. It was particularly precious. She had seen it in a magazine and liked it very much. Unfortunately, although Yu Lily liked it, she couldn't afford it. Seeing her coming over, Yi Qianqian felt a little familiar, so she nodded with a smile. However, Shen Manting didn't even look at Yi Qianqian. She looked straight at Yu Lily and asked, "Is your chief editor Zhou here?" "Yes, in the office. Let me call her for you?" While Yu Lily was talking, she had already picked up the phone and called Chief Editor Zhou. Shen Manting looked at her with a big smile and said, "Thank you. This is for you." She casually threw the fur ball into Yu Lily's arms. Yu Lily was stunned and looked at Shen Manting. Shen Manting winked at her and said, "I bought it casually, but it doesn't look good on me. I think you look beautiful in red, so I gave it to you." Yu Lily couldn't believe it. When she was about to say something, Shen Manting turned around and was about to go inside. "Wait." Yu Lily stopped her and said, "This thing is very expensive." "Oh, I don't like it." "If you don't like it, you can give it to someone else. But I really think it suits you. You can hang it on your bag. It must be very beautiful." Shen Manting waved at her and walked inside. Yu Lily felt like she had seen a ghost. Is this for real? The editor-in-chief actually gave such a valuable thing to him just like that? She was too generous. Yu Lily felt a little surprised. Looking at Shen Manting's back, she shouted, "Thank you." Shen Manting's back was facing her, and a triumphant smile flashed across her face. She waved her hand and walked into the room. Yi Qianqian looked at the fur ball in Yu Lily's hand and felt a little envious. She said, "That's nice. This thing seems very expensive." Yu Lily really liked it. She held it in her hand and couldn't wait to hang it on her bag. The handbag was also a very beautiful bright red, and it complemented the fur ball very well. So beautiful. Yi Qianqian liked it very much, but she still sighed and said, "That's great. I'm going to work now. You can continue reviewing the contract." Yu Lily smiled and nodded. She raised her hand and said, "Thank you for the coffee." "You're welcome." After Yi Qianqian left, Yu Lily secretly felt that she might have been too narrow-minded. This fur ball was even more expensive than her salary, yet the chief editor had given it to her so casually. He probably wasn't targeting her on purpose, right? Yu Lily looked at the fur ball and was in a good mood. After work, Yu Lily returned home and was surprised to find that Ming was already home. Yu Lily was carrying the groceries she had just bought and said, "Why are you back so early today? I haven't cooked yet." Ming sat in the living room, glanced at the groceries in her hand and said, "Put them in the fridge. I ordered takeout." As he spoke, he stood up and walked toward Yu Lily. Ming's long fingers were holding a cigarette, which was slowly emitting smoke. Yu Lily looked at him and didn't care. She sorted the groceries and put them in the fridge. Before she finished, Oh Ming had already hugged her waist. Oh Ming gently exhaled the smoke in her ear. With a faint evil smile on his lips he said, "You Lily, how long have you lived here?" His voice was low. As he spoke, Oh Ming held her waist with both hands and rubbed his head forward. He gently rubbed his cheek against her face, and the corners of his lips seemed to touch her from time to time. If it had been the usual You Lily, she would definitely have raised her head to meet his touch. But at that moment You Lily felt a little uncomfortable. You Lily looked sideways, kissed him gently on the lips and said, "About 10 days?" Oh Ming closed the refrigerator door and gently pressed her against the refrigerator door. With a slightly upturned voice he said, "It's 11 days. In a few days it will be half a month." You Lily had recently gained some weight. Compared with the bones when she first came back, she now had a lot of meat on her body. Even her hair had grown a little longer. Compared with a few days ago, she looked twice as good. Today in the office, she suddenly remembered the feeling of the past. Oh Ming simply got off work early and returned home. After waiting for a long time, You Lily returned home. Oh Ming touched her belly with his big hand, gently squeezed it and said, "Is your illness better?" In order to respect her, Oh Ming had not expressed any intention of asking for anything during this time. But today he couldn't help it. Oh Ming gently pressed her against the refrigerator door and leaned over to kiss her gently. Seeing this, You Lily suddenly understood. Her heart tightened and she felt a little nervous and guilty. Facing his fiery gaze, You Lily put her hands around his neck and said, "Not yet." You Lily was about to speak, but Oh Ming had already pressed her down and kissed her fiercely. You Lily exclaimed, and her slender waist was almost broken. She shouted, "Be gentle." Oh Ming heard that and loosened his grip, but his action was still not gentle. You Lily let him do whatever he wanted, but her body didn't feel anything. She was even a little annoyed and disgusted. An idea quickly began to expand in her mind. All he wanted was her body. When this idea popped out, You Lily's originally reluctant heart felt more and more impatient. She gently pushed him away, but Oh Ming didn't let her move. He looked at her with a pair of deep peach blossom eyes. They looked at each other and didn't say a word. Just as he was about to find a bar to relax, he received a call from his mother. When he heard that she was in the West Mountain Villa, he suddenly felt a headache. Oh Ming drove to the Shishan Villa area and rang the doorbell. Chapter 9:11. Shin Manting was obviously very happy to see him. She pulled him in and then closed the door. Oh Ming looked inside and frowned. He looked around and asked, "Where is my mother?" Shin Manting stood behind Oh Ming and did not speak. Oh Ming turned around impatiently, but when he turned around he was stunned. Shin Manting had taken off her bathrobe. When Oh Ming turned around he saw Shin Manting's sexy figure at a glance. Her sexy black lace underwear accentuated her fair skin, making it look even more tender and beautiful. Oh Ming's eyes fell on her body immediately. Her beautiful body proportion, well-maintained skin, and figure were all the best. Shin Manting leaped up and pounced on Oh Ming. Oh Ming was shocked and subconsciously wanted to avoid her. Shin Manting had expected it. She turned around and hugged him tightly. Shin Manting was a little shorter than You Lily, but she was much sexier than You Lily. She was petite and exquisite. From Oh Ming's point of view, he could clearly see Shin Manting's deep white cleavage. Seduction. Oh Ming was a man and a normal man in the prime of his life. He didn't enjoy himself at home. Now seeing such a picture, Oh Ming only felt his throat tighten. Shin Manting sensed his reaction and kissed him on the lips. Oh Ming swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Seeing her obvious seduction, he suddenly felt that he couldn't control himself. However, at the same time, his mind seemed to think of You Lily's beautiful face. Oh Ming turned his head and reached out to push her away. With a straight face, Oh Ming looked at Shin Manting in front of him and was a little annoyed. "What are you doing?" Shin Manting had delicate makeup on her face. She pouted and said, "We are engaged. Isn't it normal to meet each other's physical needs?" As she spoke, she walked toward Oh Ming and said, "Sooner or later we will be husband and wife. Oh Ming, don't leave tonight." When Oh Ming heard that, his eyes flashed with disgust and he said angrily, "Are you so short of men? Tieske, your words are too hurtful. Oh Ming, you are my fiancé. Isn't your first duty to satisfy me?" Shin Manting walked up to him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "It's better than staying with a mistress who can't satisfy you, right?" When Oh Ming heard that, his beautiful peach blossom eyes shone with a sharp light. Shin Manting was startled by the look in his eyes and stopped in her tracks. "What do you know?" Oh Ming looked at her and took a step forward. "Are you spying on me?" Ming's aura was more powerful than Shin Manting had imagined. When he took a step forward, Shin Manting subconsciously took a step back. But then he realized that he should have gone up to meet them. She smiled coquettishly and stepped forward, saying, "If I had that ability, would I still be afraid that I wouldn't be able to take you down?" As she spoke, she untied the strap of her underwear and winked at him. "I know you also want to," she said coquettishly. Ming's face darkened. He pushed her away without any pity and said angrily, "Get lost." Chapter 9:12. Ming's face was cold. He turned and walked out. Shin Manting looked at Ming's back and shouted, "What's so good about that, mistress? Ming, you be *****starred." Ming opened the door wide and walked out without the slightest intention of closing the door. The cold wind blew in and Shin Manting shivered from the cold. Seeing Ming's lack of pity, Shin Manting was so angry that she hit the sofa and shouted, "Be *****starred." After what Shin Manting had done, Ming felt even more suffocated. He found a random bar and downed a lot of alcohol. Ming was drunk, but he could only lie on the bar feeling dizzy. Losing his balance, Ming fell straight down. Bang! The stool was overturned by Ming and the noise was loud. The waiter had a headache and helped him up. He said, "Sir, you should call someone to pick you up. How can you drink so much?" Ming was dizzy from the fall and his mind was a mess. The waiter knew that he was too drunk, so he said, "Where's your phone? Take it out and see who is the best person to call." When Ming heard that, he took the phone out of his pocket and pressed the 1 key. The waiter was a little speechless because the number that Ming dialed turned out to be the word that cursed people the most. Bitch. Lily was drawing. There were only a few strokes left on the last frame. Seeing that she was finally about to finish the first episode, she felt indescribably satisfied. The phone rang. It was Ming. "Hello. Lily." Ming sounded drunk as he shouted, "I'm drinking." Lily frowned and asked, "Where are you?" "Where am I? I don't know." Ming sounded very drunk. Ming's alcohol tolerance was very good. To be able to drink to this extent, how much could he drink? The waiter quickly took the phone and gave Lily the address. Lily put down her paintbrush without saying a word, put on some clothes, and took a taxi to the bar the waiter had mentioned. Ming was helped to sit at the bar counter. In front of him was a large pile of wine bottles and glasses. Lily had a headache. She quickly took her hand from the waiter and said, "Thank you. Let me do it." When Ming heard Lily's voice, he turned his head and smiled happily. "You're here?" As he spoke, he hugged her with both hands and said, "Let's go home." The smell of alcohol filled the air. Lily frowned in disgust, pushed him away and said, "How much did you drink? The smell is so strong." When the waiter saw Lily, he was a little surprised, but he still took out the bill and said, "This gentleman drank a lot of wine and you haven't paid yet." Lily looked at the list and felt a headache. Ming held her in his arms and rested his head on her neck, panting slightly. He must have drunk too much and was feeling unwell, right? Lily patted his face in disgust, took out the leather armor from his pocket, took out a card and handed it to the waiter. The waiter took the POS machine and entered the password for Lily. Lily skillfully entered the password, but it was wrong. Lily was stunned. When she saw the waiter's surprised look, she felt a little embarrassed. Chapter 9:13. Did he change the password? Lily glanced at the card, frowned, and changed another one. There were many cards in Ming's leather armor, but after trying 3 or 4 of them, the passwords were all wrong. Lily's face was so hot that she could cook an egg. She patted Ming's face and asked, "Hey, what is the password of your card?" Ming was already asleep, and he didn't feel anything after being patted. Lily just went out in a hurry, so she only brought enough money to take a taxi, and she didn't prepare a card at all. Now this situation is so embarrassing. Under everyone's gaze, Lily searched Ming's wallet again, and then took out 3 or 4 cards. After swiping them again, all of them were wrong. Feeling more and more strange eyes around, Lily finally found a card, a red goddess card. It used to be used by her, and at the same time, it was also opened in her name. When Lily saw this card, she couldn't tell how much she missed it. However, this card was the salary card that she enjoyed when she was still a nominal supervisor in a European-style shopping mall. At that time, she managed 3 or 4 stores, each of which was a big brand with very good business, so the dividends were naturally not to be underestimated. After Lily returned all the money to Ming, she left the card in the villa. Ming had already cancelled her dividends and now there should be no money in it. However, it was the last card in Oming's wallet. Sighing in her heart, Yu Lily handed the card to the waiter. At this point she could only make a desperate attempt. The password of this card was Oming's birthday. Oming said it himself, and Yu Lily didn't change it back later. Yu Lily entered the password and she had already prepared the excuse to put it on credit, but to her surprise, it showed that the payment was successful. The waiter finally breathed a sigh of relief and said, "I will help you take him back. He drove here." "Okay, thank you." The waiter helped Oming back to the car, and Yu Lily took the car key from Oming's pocket and drove back to the apartment. Oming was lying in the back seat all the way and he howled from time to time. Yu Lily parked the car in the garage. When she looked at the back seat, Oming had already fallen into the gap of the car seat. Yu Lily was exasperated. She reached out and pulled Oming up. "That's too much. Why did you drink so much?" He tried to pull but to no avail. Oming seemed to know what she was doing and got up. After Yu Lily finally managed to drag him out, the further he walked, the more inclined he became. It was very difficult for Yu Lily to carry it. She pulled hard and shouted, "Stand straight." It was past midnight and there weren't many people in the garage. Yu Lily's roar echoed in the garage. At the same time, a beautiful orange-red Maserati drove in and parked in the underground garage. Yu Lily was overjoyed and turned to look. The car soon came to a stop and a man in a pink suit stepped out. When Shinjulia saw Yu Lily he was shocked and overjoyed. When Yu Lily saw him she felt that it was inevitable. She wanted to run but Oming was too heavy. Yu Lily's hands were sore but she still couldn't move him. Chapter 9:14. Brother-in-law? Yu Lily couldn't believe it and looked at him. Brother-in-law? This man is called Shinjulia and Oming's fiancé is called Shin Manting. It can't be so coincidental, can it? Is he Shin Manting's younger brother? Shinjulia came forward and pulled Oming up with one hand. He straightened Oming's face and said, "Ha, it's really my future brother-in-law." But then he looked at Yu Lily with some disbelief and said, "Are you the mistress my sister talked about? My God, the world is so small." Yu Lily's heart sank. She glared at him and then slapped his hand away and shouted, "Get out of my way." Shinjulia also realized that his words might have been a little inappropriate, so he laughed dryly and ran over to Yu Lily. He reached out his hand to take Oming from her. Yu Lily roared, "Get out of my way, don't touch my man. He is not your brother-in-law." Shinjulia was shocked by her anger and waved his hand helplessly. Well, but you can't carry him alone. Let me help you carry him up, okay?" Yu Lily's eyes were red and she stared at him. She put her hands under Oming's armpits and half dragged and half pulled him to the elevator. Shinjulia knew that he said something wrong so he shut his mouth. But when he saw her struggling he couldn't stand it anymore. He went forward and pulled Oming who was in her arms over and said, "Oh, let me help you. Let's go." Shinjulia pulled Oming. Obviously he was much stronger than Yu Lily. He pulled Oming up without any effort. Yu Lily looked at him and her heart was empty. This man turned out to be Oming's future brother-in-law. Shinjulia carried Oming to the elevator. When he turned his head, he found that Yu Lily was still standing in the same place. He shouted, "Hey, follow me." "Which floor is it?" Yu Lily walked up quickly and the elevator arrived. When the elevator door opened, Yu Lily stepped in and pressed the button for the 28th floor. He said, "You are so cunning. I went to the 26th floor to look for you many times, but the 4 owners of the 26th floor said they didn't know you. It turns out that you live on the 28th floor. My brother-in-law is the only one living on the 28th floor. You really live with my brother-in-law?" Moreover, it was said that this was Oming's private residence. Even Oming's parents had never been here before. How could this woman live here so openly? Shinjulia looked at her and shook his head. Yu Lily didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt sympathy and regret on Shinjulia's face. Yu Lily glared at him. Before Yu Lily could speak, Oming spoke first. "You?" Oming's voice carried a strong sense of intoxication. He opened his eyes, which were bloodshot. He raised his hand and reached out to Yu Lily. Yu Lily went forward and hugged him. Her heart was slightly sour. She whispered, "Well, I'm here. I'm home." As Yu Lily got closer, the distance between her and Shinjulia was also shortened. Shinjulia could clearly smell the fresh fragrance of Yu Lily in addition to the smell of alcohol on Oming's body. It smelled good and it was very comfortable, just like her. Shinjulia sniffed and felt his heart was moved. He said, "Your name is Yu Lily, right? I've heard of you." I highly recommend my new book, 99 Days of Hidden Marriage. Chief, please be reserved. It's super good. On the surface he was a cold-hearted young master who was loyal to his country, but in secret he was an all-powerful and mysterious monarch. She schemed step by step, cheated him of all his first times, left all his property and ran away. Unexpectedly the next day she was brought to the church with a knife. He announced in a loud voice, "Marry or die." Chapter 9:16. Ming held her and lay on the sofa with a satisfied smile on his lips. He closed his eyes and circled her in his arms. One night, Lily was sore all over. The sofa was too small to accommodate both of them. But Ming held her all night, and Lily didn't dare to move easily. Throughout the night, both of them maintained the same position, and their bodies were stiff. Ming had a splitting headache. When he woke up, he was holding the woman in his arms and was a little confused. The clothes on his upper body were still intact, but there was nothing on his lower body. There was a smooth touch in his arms. Ming gently moved and Lily woke up. Feeling the softness in his arms, Ming was a little reluctant to let her go. He held her tightly and whispered, "How did I come back last night?" Lily heard this and was a little dumbfounded. She elbowed him back and said, "You still have the nerve to ask." She briefly explained what happened, but Ming listened with a blank face. "Did you forget?" Lily looked at him and was a little disappointed. Ming also shook his head and said, "I forgot, but there is one thing I remember very clearly." "What?" Lily asked curiously. Ming leaned over, gently pressed her down and said, "Is your coldness cured?" Lily blushed, and before she could speak, Ming hugged her tightly and bent his head to kiss her. Dense hot kisses fell on Lily's collarbone and neck. The traces of last night were still clearly in front of her, and the smile on Ming's face widened. Entering, Lily let out a cry of surprise. Her legs were folded and she gritted her teeth to bear him. The sofa swayed with their movements, but Lily had no feeling of last night and even some pain. It was not the same feeling as last night. Frowning, Lily pushed him away. At the same time there was a trace of sticky blood. Ming was stunned and asked, "Are you bleeding?" Lily was also a little confused. She reached out and touched it and there was indeed blood. Her waist was also a little sore. She thought it was because she maintained the same position all night, but now it seemed that it was Aunt Flo. Calculating the time, Aunt menstruation seemed to have been delayed. Under normal circumstances, it should have happened the day before yesterday or the day before yesterday. Looking at Ming's obviously broken expression, she smiled apologetically and said, "It seems like I'm on my period." The corners of Ming's lips twitched as he felt like he was about to be blown away by the wind. Lily felt a little guilty and shrank her head. All of a sudden, Lily looked up and shouted, "What time is it now?" Looking at the time, it was already past 8 in the morning. "It's over, it's over." Lily hurriedly put on her clothes and said, "It's too late for work. What should I do? The editor-in-chief doesn't like me. If he finds out, he will fire me directly. It's all your fault." When Ming heard that, he frowned and looked at her. "The chief editor is against you?" "What? How would I know why? I was there to interview for the position of assistant editor, but the chief editor insisted that I go to the front desk. He even gave me a look as if I was taking advantage of him. Oh my God, this is ridiculous." Chapter 9:17. "No, if I ask for leave, editor-in-chief Zhou will deal with me. I don't want to lose this job." Lily shouted as she put on her clothes. She looked at the time. It was almost 9 o'clock. It would take at least half an hour to get there. Lily felt that her life was bleak. She sat on the sofa in despair and shouted, "It's over. I'm doomed to be late." Ming looked at her timid appearance and felt helpless. Lily didn't notice the change in Ming's expression. She quickly changed her clothes, put on a sanitary pad, picked up her bag and ran. But when she started running, Lily suddenly felt sore all over. Damn it, it was not only because she didn't sleep well last night, but also because of her period and the crazy morning. Lily took the subway to the company and was ready to be scolded by editor-in-chief Zhou. Gasping, Lily looked at the time. Lily knew that she couldn't escape the scolding, so she ran to editor-in-chief Zhou's office. Seeing editor-in-chief Zhou sitting at the desk, she closed her eyes and shouted, "Editor-in-chief Zhou, I'm sorry I'm late." Her voice was loud and full of infinite sincerity. However, the storm that she imagined did not come as expected. Lily quietly opened her eyelids and looked forward. Editor-in-chief Zhou seemed to be in a heavy mood, staring at Lily. Lily felt her hair stand on end. She shrunk her head and said, Did you punch in? Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at her, and her voice was indescribably soft. Yu Lily closed her eyes, shook her head again and said, "Not yet. Go and punch in. There are a lot of contracts waiting for you to review today. Ziyu asked for leave today. Go and study with Yi Qianqian." Yu Lily was a little stunned. Looking at the kind editor-in-chief Zhou in front of her, she felt that the sun was rising from the west. She didn't scold me? What? She actually asked me to study with Yi Qianqian? My God, is today the end of the world? However, the more editor-in-chief Zhou behaved like this, the more Yu Lily dared not act rashly. Looking at editor-in-chief Zhou, Yu Lily asked, "What about the receptionist? The staff at the front desk will be here next week. You have to learn first before you can be a good editor. Go and clock in. Since this is the first time you've been late, I won't deduct your salary. If there's a next time, I won't let you off so easily." Yu Lily felt a little confused. Today's editor-in-chief Zhou is too easy to talk to. However, Yu Lily couldn't have asked for more. After nodding, she ran away. When Yu Lily left, editor-in-chief Zhou immediately breathed a sigh of relief. She looked at the young face on the computer screen and said with a smile, "Special Assistant Su, as you can see, I have nothing to say about Yu Lily. I hope you won't complain to the president. I didn't know that she had a relationship with the president. It was Miss Shin who asked me to do this. If I had known, I wouldn't have listened to her." When Su Qing heard this, he shook his head and said, "It doesn't matter. Go to the Human Resource Department at the headquarters to go through the formalities." Assistant. Chapter 9:18. He didn't even give her a chance to explain or redeem herself. Editor-in-Chief Zhou's face suddenly turned pale and she couldn't believe it. Editor-in-Chief Zhou's strength was beyond doubt. But the most important point was that Editor-in-Chief Zhou knew how to read people's words and expressions. Although it was a bit despicable, such a method was undoubtedly time-tested. But who knew that I would fall into such a trap? Could it be that the face of the future CEO's wife was not as important as that of a special assistant? Although Yu Lily was appointed by Special Assistant Su to stay, she is still the future wife of the president. How could Special Assistant Su do this? The more Editor-in-Chief Zhou thought about it, the angrier she became. Special Assistant Su wants to abuse his power and fire me? Ah, what a joke. In any case, she was considered a wily old fox. How could she be fired so easily? Editor-in-Chief Zhou picked up the phone and dialed Shin Manting's number. Editor-in-Chief Zhou felt so wrong that her eyes turned red. Hearing that the phone was picked up, Editor-in-Chief Zhou immediately began to feel wronged. Editor-in-Chief Zhou told the story roughly, and even added oil and vinegar. Finally she asked, "What should we do, Miss Shin? Special Assistant Su has gone too far." Shin Manting seemed to chuckle and said, "I can't control this. After all, I also have to look at his mood. Maybe you can pretend to be pitiful and ask Yu Lily for help. Maybe she will sympathize with you and help you so that you won't be fired." Yi Qianqian was speechless. "Miss Shin, I'm doing this to help you. If I didn't help you, how could I have transferred Yu Lily to the front desk? How could I have targeted her again and again? I know that you installed a listening device in the thing you gave her last time. Do you think she'll hate you to death if I tell her?" Editor-in-Chief Zhou's voice was a bit gloomy. "She doesn't seem to be on guard against you at all. If I remind her, what do you think she will do?" Yu Lily stood outside and heard those words clearly. She stood there in disbelief. Subconsciously, she glanced at the beautiful little fur ball hanging on her bag. That thing was really beautiful and Yu Lily liked it very much. However, such a small thing actually had a listening device in it? Also, did Chief Editor Zhou just say Miss Shin? Is she Ming's fiancé, Shin Manting? Yu Lily gritted her teeth angrily. It turned out that Shin Manting had already gotten close to her and was targeting her. Poor Yu Lily. She didn't even know it. If it wasn't for the fact that she wanted to come over and thank him, she would probably be in even more trouble in the next few days. Yu Lily angrily plucked the fur ball and planned to throw it away. But then, as if he had thought of something, he retracted the little fur ball. Since it was a listening device, it should be able to hear everything from her side, right? In other words, wherever fur ball was, all sounds could be clearly transmitted? Thinking of this, Yu Lily actually felt that it was a little fun. The corners of her lips curled up, and traces of playfulness flashed across her beautiful almond-shaped eyes. She had already delivered herself to his doorstep, so why should he let her off so easily? It was time to recoup the losses. Chapter 9:19. Looking at Editor-in-Chief Zhou inside, Yu Lily turned around and returned to her seat. Putting down her bag, Yu Lily went back to Editor-in-Chief Zhou's office. Editor-in-Chief Zhou might have just finished a phone call. Her eyes were red. When she saw Yu Lily, she sniffed and looked like she was about to cry. Yu Lily walked in and watched Editor-in-Chief Zhou close the door. Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at her actions and felt a little inexplicable. At the same time, she was a little angry and asked, "What do you want to do?" Yu Lily did not answer. After sitting down, she looked around, then picked up her mobile phone and typed, "You don't have a listening device in here, do you?" Editor-in-Chief Zhou was stunned. She looked around and found that Shin Manting had sent gifts everywhere. It was hard to say. But seeing Yu Lily like this, she knew that she might have already known something. Editor-in-Chief Zhou stopped hiding and gave her a look. "Let's talk outside." The two reached an agreement for a while, and it was indescribably harmonious. Editor-in-Chief Zhou took Yu Lily to the rooftop of the company. In addition to her clothes, she did not even bring her mobile phone. She said, "Tell me, what do you want to say? You just called Shin Manting, didn't you? I heard everything just now. Are you in some kind of trouble that you can't solve?" When Editor-in-Chief Zhou heard Yu Lily's question, she felt a little hypocritical. She sneered and said, "What do you think? I really didn't expect you to have such a good relationship with Special Assistant Su. Now Su Qing, that B** starred, wants me to leave." Su Qing? Hearing the name, Yu Lily was stunned. Su Qing, wasn't he the young man who worked with O Ming in the capital? It turned out to be him. So, her work was arranged by O Ming? Yu Lily suddenly felt depressed. It turned out to be like this. Why did he ask you to leave? You went to Shin Manting? Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at her suspiciously and asked, "Do you really not know? I should have thought of it long ago." At that time, when the website was newly opened, every editor was very idle. There was no need for an assistant editor at all. Why would there be a need to recruit people for no reason? That Shan Yu should be helping you to cover up. It was only logical for her to let you in. It's a pity that I didn't know. If I had known, I wouldn't have targeted you like that. Shin Manting asked me to take good care of you. So, do you want revenge? I have a way to deal with her. Yu Lily already had an idea in her mind. She raised her eyebrows and looked at Editor-in-Chief Zhou. Maybe I can convince Special Assistant Su to let you stay. Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at her suspiciously and nodded. With the help of O Ming's mother, Shin Manting was now working at the headquarters of the O Group. At that moment, she was having a regular department meeting. However, this roundabout meeting of department heads was really boring. Shin Manting placed her phone under the table and played with it. Suddenly, she received a multimedia message. It was Chief Editor Zhou's. It wasn't a photo but a short video. Looking at the cover, it was dark. Chapter 920. Shin Manting was disdainful. She knew that these words were just a gimmick. However, she was attracted by this gimmick. Shin Manting clicked on the download button, but before she clicked on the play button, the video popped up automatically. Shin Manting was shocked and subconsciously wanted to turn it off. However, she couldn't control it. The volume was instantly turned up as if it had been poisoned. It was completely out of Shin Manting's control. A loud sound rang out, and it was actually a pa-pa-pa sound that made people blush and their hearts beat rapidly. In an instant, everyone's eyes fell on Shin Manting. Shin Manting blushed and hurried to get the phone. This sound was accompanied by a woman's scream. "Brother, don't." The voice was very loud, and it was particularly loud in the quiet department meeting room. Everyone looked at Shin Manting with a strange look in their eyes. Shin Manting felt like dying. She plugged the speaker, but it didn't work at all. Not only could she not turn down the volume, but she also couldn't press the button to turn off the phone. "Shin Manting, you've gone too far. Don't you know we're in a meeting now?" The department supervisor was furious and slammed the table. "How can you watch this kind of thing during working hours? You're a woman. Don't you have any shame?" The department supervisor was originally dissatisfied with Shin Manting. Because of her connections, Shin Manting's position in the department was second only to the supervisor when she came in. Other people might not be able to climb to this position for many years, but Shin Manting was the president's fiancée. But now there was finally a chance to make a fuss. How could she not seize it? "You're a woman. Even if you're the president's fiancée, so what? You're too shameless." "It's not me." Shin Manting wanted to die. Listening to the supervisor's scolding, her face turned green and white. "I didn't mean it." "It's you? Take out the phone." The department supervisor stretched out his hand. "Hurry up." Shin Manting took out the phone, and the passionate voice on it became louder. Shin Manting couldn't turn it off, and the picture on it was also presented in front of everyone. The scale was very big. The supervisor was furious and said, "Are you that thirsty? Look, I can't turn it off. I just received a document. Someone must have deliberately sent it to me to frame me." Shin Manting roared, her face as red as blood. The department head casually pressed a button and the video was turned off. Shin Manting was shocked and couldn't believe it. "How could that be? What else do you have to say? I will tell the higher-ups to criticize you by name. Write me a self-criticism report before tomorrow." The supervisor threw her phone back to her and said sternly. Shin Manting held her phone in a daze. He casually pressed a button and the video actually ran out on its own. It was very high profile. The department head was furious and roared, "Get out, get out." Her colleagues snickered. Shin Manting was on the verge of tears. She wanted to turn off the video but she couldn't. Shin Manting lifted the lid of the cup in front of her and threw the phone into it. The phone was soaked in water. After flashing a few times there was no sound. Shin Manting walked out, her eyes red with anger. "Joe, you're finished?" You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.